My Own Story Book 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Comment where in the world you are. I find that fascinating. Chapter 1. The campaign of 1907 began with a women's parliament, called together on February 13 in Caxton Hall, to consider the provisions of the King's Speech, which had been read in the National Parliament on the opening day of the session, February 12. The King's Speech, as I have explained, is the official announcement of the government's programme for the session. When our Women's Parliament met at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 13th, we knew that the government meant to do nothing for women during the session ahead. I presided over the women's meeting, which was marked with a fervency and a determination of spirit at that time altogether unprecedented. A resolution expressing indignation that woman suffrage should have been omitted from the King's Speech, and calling upon the House of Commons to give immediate facilities to such a measure, was moved and carried. A motion to send the resolution from the Hall to the Prime Minister was also carried. The slogan, "Rise up, women," was cried from the platform, the answering shout coming back as from one woman, "Now." With copies of the resolution in their hands, the chosen deputation hurried forth into the February dusk, ready for Parliament or prison, as the fates decreed. Fate did not leave them very long in doubt. The government, it appeared, had decided that not again should their sacred halls of Parliament be desecrated by women asking for the vote, and orders had been given that would henceforth prevent women from reaching even the outer precincts of the House of Commons. So when our deputation of women arrived in the neighbourhood of Westminster Abbey, they found themselves opposed by a solid line of police, who, at a sharp order from their chief, began to stride through and through the ranks of the procession, trying to turn the women back. Bravely the women rallied and pressed forward a little farther. Suddenly a body of mounted police came riding up at a smart trot, and for the next 5 hours or more, a struggle, quite indescribable for brutality and ruthlessness, went on. The horsemen rode directly into the procession, scattering the women right and left. But still the women would not turn back. Again and again they returned, only to fly again and again from the merciless hoofs. Some of the women left the streets for the pavements, but even there the horsemen pursued them, pressing them so close to walls and railings that they were obliged to retreat temporarily to avoid being crushed. Other strategists took refuge in doorways, but they were dragged out by the foot police and were thrown directly in front of the horses. Still the women fought to reach the House of Commons with their resolution. They fought until their clothes were torn, their bodies bruised, and the last ounce of their strength exhausted. 15 of them did actually fight their way through those hundreds on hundreds of police, foot and mounted, as far as the strangers' lobby of the House. Here they attempted to hold a meeting, and were arrested. Outside, many more women were taken into custody. It was 10 o'clock before the last arrest was made, and the square cleared of the crowds. After that the mounted men continued to guard the approaches to the House of Commons until the House rose at midnight. The next morning 57 women and 2 men were arraigned, 2 and 3 at a time, in Westminster Police Court. Emmeline Pankhurst was the first to be placed in the dock. She tried to explain to the magistrate that the deputation of the day before was a perfectly peaceful attempt to present a resolution, which, sooner or later, would be presented and acted upon. She assured him that the deputation was but the beginning of a campaign that would not cease until the government yielded to the women's demand. "There can be no going back for us," she declared, "and more will happen if we do not get justice." The magistrate, Mr. Curtis Bennet, who was destined later to try women for that more, rebuked my daughter sternly, telling her that the government had nothing to do with causing the disorders of the day before, that the women were entirely responsible for what had occurred, and finally, that these disgraceful scenes in the street must cease just as King Canute told the ocean that it must roll out instead of in. "The scenes can be stopped in only one way," replied the prisoner. His sole reply to that was, 20 shillings or 14 days. Christable chose the prison sentence, and so did all the other prisoners. Mrs. Despard, who headed the deputation, and Sylvia Pankhurst, who was with her, were given 3 weeks in prison. Of course, the raid, as it was called, gave the Women's Social and Political Union an enormous amount of publicity, on the whole, favorable publicity. The newspapers were almost unanimous in condemning the government for sending mounted troops out against unarmed women. Angry questions were asked in Parliament, and our ranks once more increased in size and ardour. The old-fashioned suffragists, men as well as women, cried out that we had alienated all our friends in Parliament, but this proved to be untrue. Indeed, it was found that a Liberal member, Mr. Dickinson, had won the first place in the ballot, and had announced that he intended to use it to introduce a women's suffrage bill. More than this, the Prime Minister, Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, promised to give the bill his support. For a time, a very short time, it is true, we felt that the hour of our freedom might be at hand, that our prisoners had perhaps already won us our precious symbol, the vote. Soon, however, a number of professed suffragists in the House began to complain that Mr. Dickinson's bill, practically the original bill, was not democratic enough, that it would enfranchise only the women of the upper classes, to which, by the way, most of them belonged. That this was not true had been proved again and again from the municipal registers, which showed a majority of working women's names as qualified householders. The contention was but a shallow excuse, and we knew it. Therefore we were not surprised when Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman departed from his pledge of support, and allowed the bill to be talked out. Following this event, the Second Women's Parliament assembled, on the afternoon of March 20, 1907. As before, we adopted a resolution calling upon the government to introduce an official suffrage measure, and again we voted to send the resolution from the Hall to the Prime Minister. Lady Harberton was chosen to lead the deputation, and instantly hundreds of women sprang up and volunteered to accompany her. This time the police met the women at the door of the hall, and another useless, disgraceful scene of barbarous, brute force opposition took place. Something like 1,000 police had been sent out to guard the House of Commons from the peaceful invasion of a few hundred women. All afternoon and evening we kept Caxton Hall open, the women returning every now and again, singly and in small groups, to have their bruises bathed, or their torn clothing repaired. As night fell, the crowds in the street grew denser, and the struggle between the women and the police became more desperate. Lady Harberton, we heard, had succeeded in reaching the entrance to the House of Commons, nay, had actually managed to press past the sentries into the lobby, but her resolution had not been presented to the Prime Minister. She and many others were arrested before the police at last succeeded in clearing the streets, and the dreadful affair was over. The next day, in Westminster Police Court, the magistrate meted out sentences varying from 20 shillings or 14 days to 40 shillings or 1 month's imprisonment. 2 of the women, Miss Woodlock and Mrs. Chatterton, who had left Holloway only a week before, were, as old offenders, given 30 days without the option of a fine. Another woman, Mary Lee, was given 30 days because she offended the magistrate's dignity by hanging a Votes for Women banner over the edge of the dock. Those of my readers who are unable to connect the word militancy with anything milder than arson are invited to reflect that within the first 2 months of the year 1907 the English government sent to prison 130 women whose militancy consisted merely of trying to carry a resolution from a hall to the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. Our crime was called obstructing the police. It will be seen that it was the police who did the obstructing. It may be asked why neither of these deputations was led by me personally. The reason was that I was needed in another capacity, that of leader and supervisor of the suffrage forces in the field to defeat government candidates at by-elections. On the night of the second riot, while our women were still struggling in the streets, I left London for Hexham in Northumberland, where by our work the majority of the Liberal candidate was reduced by 1,000 votes. 7 more by-elections followed in rapid succession. Our by-election work was such a new thing in English politics that we attracted an enormous amount of attention wherever we went. It was our custom to begin work the very hour we entered a town. If, on our way from the station to the hotel, we encountered a group of men, say, in the marketplace, we either stopped and held a meeting on the spot, or else we stayed long enough to tell them when and where our meetings were to be held, and to urge them to attend. The usual first step, after securing lodgings, was to hire a vacant shop, fill the windows with suffrage literature, and fling out our purple, green, and white flag. Meanwhile, some of us were busy hiring the best available hall. If we got possession of the battleground before the men, we sometimes cornered all the good halls and left the candidate nothing but schoolhouses for his indoor meetings. Truth to tell, our meetings were so much more popular than theirs that we really needed the larger halls. Often, a candidate with the suffragettes for rivals spoke to almost empty benches. The crowds were away listening to the women. Naturally, this greatly displeased the politicians, and it scandalized many of the old-fashioned liberal partisans. In one place, I think it was Colne Valley in Yorkshire, an amusing instance of masculine hostility occurred. We had arrived on a day when both Conservative and Liberal committees were choosing their candidates, and we thought it a good opportunity to hold a series of outdoor meetings. We tried to get a lorry for a rostrum, but the only man in town who had these big vans to let disapproved of suffragettes so violently that he wouldn't let us have one. So we borrowed a chair from a woman shopkeeper, and went at it. Soon we had a large crowd and an interested audience. We also got the attention of a number of small boys with pea shooters, and had to make our speeches under a blistering fire of dried peas. While I was speaking, the fire ceased, to my relief, for dried peas sting. I continued my speech with renewed vigor, only to have one of my best points spoiled by roars of laughter from the crowd. I finished somehow, and sat down, and then it was explained to me that the pea shooters had been financed by one of the prominent liberals of the town, another man who disapproved of our policy of opposing the government. As soon as the ammunition gave out, this man furnished the boys with a choice supply of rotten oranges. These were not so easily handled, it appeared, for the very first one went wild, and struck the chivalrous gentleman violently in the neck. This it was that had caused the laughter, and stopped the attack on the women. We met with some pretty rough horseplay, and even with some brutality, in several by-elections, but on the whole we found the men ready, and the women more than ready, to listen to us. We tamed and educated a public that had always been used to violence at elections. We even tamed the boys, who came to the meetings on purpose to skylark. When we were in Rutlandshire that spring, 3 schoolboys came to see me and told me, shyly, that they were interested in suffrage. They had had a debate on the subject at their school, and although the decision had been for the other side, all the boys wanted to know more about it. Wouldn't I please have a meeting especially for them? Of course I consented, and I found my boy audience quite delightful. Indeed, I hope they liked me half as well as I did them. All through the spring our by-election work continued with amazing success, although our part in the government losses was rarely admitted by the politicians. The voters knew, however. At an election in Suffolk, where we helped to double the Unionist vote, the successful candidate, speaking to the crowd from his hotel window, said, "What has been the cause of the great and glorious victory?" Instantly the crowd roared, "Votes for women! 3 cheers for the suffragettes!" This was not at all what the successful candidate had intended, but he waved his hand graciously and said, "No doubt the ladies had something to do with it." The newspaper correspondents were not so reluctant to acknowledge our influence. Even when they condemned our policy, they were unsparing in their admiration for our energy, and the courage and ardor of our workers. Said the correspondent of the London Tribune, a liberal paper hostile to our tactics, "Their staying power, judging them by the standards of men, is extraordinary. By taking afternoon as well as evening meetings, they have worked twice as hard as the men. They are up earlier, they retire just as late. Women against men, they are better speakers, more logical, better informed, better phrased, with a surer insight for the telling argument. After a summer spent in strengthening our forces, organizing new branches, holding meetings, something like 3,000 of these between May and October, invading meetings of cabinet ministers. We managed to do that about once every day, electioneering, and getting up huge demonstrations in various cities. We arrived at the end of the year. In the last months of the year, I directed several hotly contested by-elections, at one of which I met with one of the most serious misadventures of my life. This by-election was held in the division of Mid-Devon, a stronghold of liberalism. In fact, since its creation in 1885, the seat has never been held by any except a Liberal member. The constituency is a large one, divided into 8 districts. The population of the towns is a rough and boisterous one, and its devotion, blind and unreasoning, to the Liberal Party has always reflected the rude spirit of the voters. A Unionist woman told me, shortly after my arrival, that my life would be unsafe if I dared openly to oppose the Liberal candidate. She had never dared, she assured me, to wear her party colours in public. However, I did speak in our headquarters at Newton Abbot, the principal town of the division, at Hull, and at Bovey Tracy. We held meetings twice a day, calling upon the voters to beat the government in Mid-Devon, as a message that women must have votes next year. Although some of the meetings were turbulent, we were treated with much more consideration than either of the candidates, who, not infrequently, were howled down and put to flight. Often the air of their meetings was thick with decayed vegetables and dirty snowballs. We had some rather lively sessions, too. Once, at an outdoor meeting, some young roughs dragged our lorry round and round until it seemed that we must be upset, and several times the language hurled at us from the crowd was quite unfit for me to repeat. Still, we escaped actual violence until the day of the election, when it was announced that the Unionist candidate had won the seat by a majority of 1,280. We knew instantly that the deepest resentment of the Liberals would be aroused, but it did not occur to us that the resentment would be directed actively against us. After the declaration at the polls, my companion, Mrs. Martell, and I started to walk to our lodgings. Some of our friends stopped us, and drew our attention to the newly elected Unionist Member of Parliament, who was being escorted from the polling place by a strong guard of police. We were warned that our safety demanded an immediate flight from the town. I laughingly assured our friends that I was never afraid to trust myself in a crowd, and we walked on. Suddenly we were confronted by a crowd of young men and boys, clay cutters from the pits on the edge of town. These young men, who wore the red rosettes of the Liberal Party, had just heard of their candidate's defeat, and they were mad with rage and humiliation. One of them pointed to us, crying, "They did it. Those women did it." A yell went up from the crowd, and we were deluged with a shower of clay and rotten eggs. We were not especially frightened, but the eggs were unbearable, and to escape them we rushed into a little grocer's shop close at hand. The grocer's wife closed and bolted the door, but the poor grocer cried out that his place would be wrecked. I did not want that to happen, of course, so I asked them to let us out by the back door. They led us out the door, into a small backyard which led into a little lane, whence we expected to make our escape. But when we reached the yard we found that the rowdies, anticipating our move, had surged round the corner, and were waiting for us. They seized Mrs. Martell first, and began beating her over the head with their fists, but the brave wife of the shopkeeper, hearing the shouts and the oaths of the men, flung open the door and rushed to our rescue. Between us we managed to tear Mrs. Martell from her captors and get her into the house. I expected to get into the house, too, but as I reached the threshold a staggering blow fell on the back of my head, rough hands grasped the collar of my coat, and I was flung violently to the ground. Stunned, I must have lost consciousness for a moment, for my next sensation was of cold, wet mud seeping through my clothing. Sight returning to me, I perceived the men, silent now, but with a dreadful, lowering silence, closing in a ring around me. In the center of the ring was an empty barrel, and the horrid thought occurred to me that they might intend putting me in it. A long time seemed to pass, while the ring of men slowly drew closer. I looked at them, in their drab clothes smeared with yellow pit clay, and they appeared so underfed, so puny and sodden, that a poignant pity for them swept over me. Poor souls, I thought, and then I said suddenly, "Are none of you men?" Then one of the youths darted toward me, and I knew that whatever was going to happen to me was about to begin. At that very moment came shouts, and a rush of police who had fought their way through hostile crowds to rescue us. Of course the mob turned tail and fled, and I was carried gently into the shop, which the police guarded for 2 hours, before it was deemed safe for us to leave in a closed motorcar. It was many months before either Mrs. Martell or I recovered from our injuries. The rowdies, foiled of their woman prey, went to the Conservative Club, smashed all the windows in the house, and kept the members besieged there through the night. The next morning the body of a man, frightfully bruised about the head, was found in the mill race. Throughout all this disorder and probable crime, not a man was arrested. Contrast this, if you like, with the treatment given our women in London. The King opened Parliament in great state on January 29, 1908. Again his speech omitted all mention of woman's suffrage, and again the WSPU issued a call for a women's parliament, for February 11, 12th and 13th. Before it was convened we heard that an excellent place in the ballot had been won by a friend of the movement, Mr. Stanger, who promised to introduce a suffrage bill. February 28 was the day fixed for the second reading, and we realized that strong pressure would have to be brought to bear to prevent the bill being wrecked, as the Dickinson bill had been the previous year. Therefore, on the first day of the Women's Parliament, almost every woman present volunteered for the deputation, which was to try to carry the resolution to the Prime Minister. Led by 2 well-known portrait painters, the deputation left Caxton Hall and proceeded in orderly ranks, 4 abreast, toward the House of Commons. The crowds in the streets were enormous, thousands of sympathizers coming out to help the women, thousands of police determined that the women should not be helped, and thousands of curious spectators. When the struggle was over, 50 women were locked up in police court cells. The next morning, when the cases were tried, Mr. Musket, who prosecuted for the Crown, and who was perhaps a little tired of telling the suffragettes that these scenes in the streets must cease, and then seeing them go on exactly as if he had not spoken, made a very severe and terrifying address. He told the women that this time they would be subject to the usual maximum of 2 months' imprisonment, with the option of a fine of £5, but that, in case they ever offended again, the law had worse terrors in store for them. It was proposed to revive, for the benefit of the suffragettes, an act passed in the reign of Charles II, which dealt with tumultuous petitions, either to the Crown or Parliament. This act provided that no person should dare to go to the King or to Parliament with any petition, complaint, remonstrance, declaration, or other address accompanied with a number of persons above 12. A fine of £100, or 3 months' imprisonment, might be imposed under this law. The magistrate then sentenced all but 2 of the women to be bound over for 12 months, or to serve 6 weeks in the second division. 2 other women, old offenders, were given 1 month in the third division, or lowest class. All the prisoners, except 2 who had very ill relatives at home, chose the prison sentence. The next day's session of the Women's Parliament was one of intense excitement, as the women reviewed the events of the previous day, the trials, and especially the threat to revive the obsolete Act of Charles II, an act which was passed to obstruct the progress of the Liberal Party, which came into existence under the Stuarts, and under the second Charles was fighting for its life. It was an amazing thing that the political descendants of these men were proposing to revive the act to obstruct the advance of the women's cause, fighting for its life under George V and his Liberal government. At least, it was evidence that the government were baffled in their attempt to crush our movement. Emmeline Pankhurst, presiding over the second session of the Women's Parliament, said, "At last it is realized that women are fighting for freedom, as their fathers fought. If they want 12 women, aye, and more than 12, if 100 women are wanted to be tried under that act and sent to prison for 3 months, they can be found. I was not present at this session, nor had I been present at the first one. I was working in a by-election at South Leeds, the last of several important by-elections in great industrial centres, where our success was unquestioned, except by the liberal press. The elections had wound up with a great procession, and a meeting of 100,000 people on Hounslet Moor. The most wonderful enthusiasm marked that meeting. I shall never forget what splendid order the people kept, in spite of the fact that no police protection was given us, how the vast crowd parted to let our procession through, how the throngs of mill women kept up a chorus in broad Yorkshire, "Shall us win? Shall us have the vote? We shall." No wonder the old people shook their beads, and declared that there had never been out like it. My Own Story Book 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 2. With those brave shouts in my ears, I hurried down to London for the concluding session of the Parliament, for I had determined that I must be the first person to challenge the government to carry out their threat to revive the old Act of Charles II. I made a long speech to the women that day, telling them something of my experiences of the past months, and how all that I had seen and heard throughout the country had only deepened my conviction of the necessity for women's votes. I feel, I concluded, that the time has come when I must act, and I wish to be one of those to carry our resolution to Parliament this afternoon. My experience in the country, and especially in South Leeds, has taught me things that cabinet ministers, who have not had that experience, do not know, and has made me feel that I must make one final attempt to see them, and to urge them to reconsider their position before some terrible disaster has occurred. Amid a good deal of excitement and emotion, we chose the requisite 13 women, who were prepared to be arrested and tried under the Charles II Tumultuous Petitions Act. I had not entirely recovered from the attack made upon me at Mid-Devon, and my wrenched ankle was still too sensitive to make walking anything but a painful process. Seeing me begin almost at once to limp badly, Mrs. Drummond, with characteristic, blunt kindness, called to a man driving a dog-cart and asked him if he would drive me to the House of Commons. He readily agreed, and I mounted to the seat behind him, the other women forming in line behind the cart. We had not gone far when the police, who already surrounded us in great force, ordered me to dismount. Of course I obeyed and walked, or rather limped along with my companions. They would have supported me, but the police insisted that we should walk single file. Presently I grew so faint from the pain of the ankle that I called to 2 of the women, who took hold of my arms and helped me on my way. This was our one act of disobedience to police orders. We moved with difficulty, for the crowd was of incredible size. All around, as far as I could see, was the great moving, swaying, excited multitude, and surrounding us on all sides were regiments of uniformed police, foot and mounted. You might have supposed that instead of 13 women, one of them lame, walking quietly along, the town was in the hands of an armed mob. We had progressed as far as the entrance to Parliament Square, when 2 stalwart policemen suddenly grasped my arms on either side and told me that I was under arrest. My 2 companions, because they refused to leave me, were also arrested, and a few minutes later Annie Kenny and 5 other women suffered arrest. That night we were released on bail, and the next morning we were arraigned in Westminster Police Court for trial under the Charles II Act. But, as it turned out, the authorities, embarrassed by our readiness to test the Act, announced that they had changed their minds, and would continue, for the present, to treat us as common street brawlers. This was my first trial, and I listened, with a suspicion that my ears were playing tricks with my reason, to the most astonishing perjuries put forth by the prosecution. I heard that we had set forth from Caxton Hall with noisy shouts and songs, that we had resorted to the most riotous and vulgar behavior, knocking off policemen's helmets, assaulting the officers right and left as we marched. Our testimony, and that of our witnesses, was ignored. When I tried to speak in my own defense, I was cut short rudely, and was told briefly that I and the others must choose between being bound over or going to prison, in the 2nd Division, for 6 weeks. I remember only vaguely the long, jolting ride across London to Holloway Prison. We stopped at Pentonville, the men's prison, to discharge several men prisoners, and I remember shuddering at the thought of our women, many of them little past girlhood, being hailed to prison in the same van with criminal men. Arriving at the prison, we groped our way through dim corridors into the reception ward, where we were lined up against the wall for a superficial medical examination. After that we were locked up in separate cells, unfurnished, except for low, wooden stools. It seemed an endless time before my cell door was opened by a wardress, who ordered me to follow her. I entered a room where another wardress sat at a table, ready to take an inventory of my effects. Obeying an order to undress, I took off my gown, then paused. "Take off everything," was the next order. "Everything?" I faltered. It seemed impossible that they expected me to strip. In fact, they did allow me to take off my last garments in the shelter of a bathroom. I shivered myself into some frightful underclothing, old and patched and stained, some coarse, brown woolen stockings with red stripes, and the hideous prison dress stamped all over with the broad arrow of disgrace. I fished a pair of shoes out of a big basket of shoes, old and mostly mismates. A pair of coarse but clean sheets, a towel, a mug of cold cocoa, and a thick slice of brown bread were given me, and I was conducted to my cell. My first sensations when the door was locked upon me were not altogether disagreeable. I was desperately weary, for I had been working hard, perhaps a little too hard, for several strenuous months. The excitement and fatigue of the previous day, and the indignation I had suffered throughout the trial, had combined to bring me to the point of exhaustion, and I was glad to throw myself on my hard prison bed and close my eyes. But soon the relief of being alone, and with nothing to do, passed from me. Holloway Prison is a very old place, and it has the disadvantages of old places which have never known enough air and sunshine. It reeks with the odors of generations of bad ventilation, and it contrives to be at once the stuffiest and the draftiest building I have ever been in. Soon I found myself sickening for fresh air. My head began to ache. Sleep fled. I lay all night suffering with cold, gasping for air, aching with fatigue, and painfully wide awake. The next day I was fairly ill, but I said nothing about it. One does not expect to be comfortable in prison. As a matter of fact, one's mental suffering is so much greater than any common physical distress that the latter is almost forgotten. The English prison system is altogether medieval and outworn. In some of its details, the system has improved since they began to send the suffragettes to Holloway. I may say that we, by our public denunciation of the system, have forced these slight improvements. In 1907 the rules were excessively cruel. The poor prisoner, when she entered Holloway, dropped, as it were, into a tomb. No letters and no visitors were allowed for the first month of the sentence. Think of it, a whole month, more than 4 weeks, without sending or receiving a single word. One's nearest and dearest may have gone through dreadful suffering, may have been ill, may have died, meantime. One was given plenty of time to imagine all these things, for the prisoner was kept in solitary confinement in a narrow, dimly lit cell, 23 hours out of the 24. Solitary confinement is too terrible a punishment to inflict on any human being, no matter what his crime. Hardened criminals in the men's prisons, it is said, often beg for the lash instead. Picture what it must be to a woman who has committed some small offense, for most of the women who go to Holloway are small offenders, sitting alone, day after day, in the heavy silence of a cell thinking of her children at home, thinking. Some women go mad. Many suffer from shattered nerves for a long period after release. It is impossible to believe that any woman ever emerged from such a horror less criminal than when she entered it. 2 days of solitary confinement, broken each day by an hour of silent exercise in a bitterly cold courtyard, and I was ordered to the hospital. There I thought I should be a little more comfortable. The bed was better, the food a little better, and small comforts, such as warm water for washing, were allowed. I slept a little the first night. About midnight I awoke, and sat up in bed, listening. A woman in the cell next mine was moaning in long, sobbing breaths of mortal pain. She ceased for a few minutes, then moaned again, horribly. The truth flashed over me, turning me sick, as I realized that a life was coming into being, there in that frightful prison. A woman, imprisoned by men's laws, was giving a child to the world. A child born in a cell. I shall never forget that night, nor what I suffered with the birth pangs of that woman, who, I found later, was simply waiting trial on a charge which was found to be baseless. The days passed very slowly, the nights more slowly still. Being in hospital, I was deprived of chapel, and also of work. Desperate, at last I begged the wardress for some sewing, and she kindly gave me a skirt of her own to hem, and later some coarse knitting to do. Prisoners were allowed a few books, mostly of the Sunday school kind. One day I asked the chaplain if there were not some French or German books in the library, and he brought me a treasure, Auteur de mon Jardin, by Jules Janin. For a few days I was quite happy, reading my book and translating it on the absurd little slate they gave us in lieu of paper and pencil. That slate was, after all, a great comfort. I did all kinds of things with it. I kept a calendar, I wrote all the French poetry I could remember on it, I even recorded old school chorales and old English exercises. It helped wonderfully to pass the endless hours until my release. I even forgot the cold, which was the harder to bear because of the fur coat, which I knew was put away, ticketed with my name. I begged them for the coat, but they wouldn't let me have it. At last the time came when they gave me back all my things, and let me go free. At the door the governor spoke to me, and asked me if I had any complaints to make. Not of you, I replied, nor of any of the wardresses. Only of this prison, and all of men's prisons. We shall raze them to the ground. Back in my comfortable home, surrounded by loving friends, I would have rested quietly for a few days, but there was a great meeting that night at Albert Hall, to mark the close of a week of self-denial to raise money for the year's campaign. Women had sold papers, flowers, toys, swept crossings, and sung in the streets for the cause. Many women, well known in the world of art and letters, did these things. I felt that I should be doing little if I merely attended the meeting. So I went. My release was not expected until the following morning, and no one thought of my appearing at the meeting. My chairman's seat was decorated with a large placard with the inscription, Mrs. Pankhurst's chair. After all the others were seated, the speakers, and hundreds of ex-prisoners. I walked quietly onto the stage, took the placard out of the chair and sat down. A great cry went up from the women as they sprang from their seats and stretched their hands toward me. It was some time before I could see them for my tears, or speak to them for the emotion that shook me like a storm. The next morning I, with the other released prisoners, drove off to Peckham, a constituency of London, where the WSPU members were fighting a vigorous by-election. In open breaks we paraded the streets, dressed in our prison clothes, or exact reproductions of them. Naturally, we attracted a great deal of attention and sympathy, and our daily meetings on Peckham Rye, as their common is known, drew enormous crowds. When polling day came our members were stationed at every polling booth, and many men as they came to the booths told us that they were, for the first time, voting for the women, by which they meant against the government. That night, amid great excitement, it was made known that the Liberal majority of 2,339 at the last general election had been turned into a Conservative majority of 2,494. Letters poured into the newspapers, declaring that the loss of this important Liberal seat was due almost entirely to the work of the suffragettes, and many prominent Liberals called upon party leaders to start doing something for women before the next general election. The Liberal leaders, with the usual perspicacity of politicians, responded not at all. Instead they beheld with approval the rise to highest power the archenemy of the suffragists, Mr. Asquith. Mr. Asquith became Prime Minister about Easter time, 1908, on the resignation, on account of ill health, of Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman. Mr. Asquith was chosen, not because of any remarkable record of statesmanship, nor yet because of great personal popularity, for he possessed neither, but simply because no better man seemed available just then. He was known as a clever, astute, and somewhat unscrupulous lawyer. He had filled several high offices to the satisfaction of his party, and under Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, a post which is generally regarded as a stepping stone to the premiership. The best thing the Liberal press found to say of the new Premier was that he was a strong man. Generally in politics this term is used to describe an obstinate man, and this we already knew Mr. Asquith to be. He was a bluntly outspoken opponent of woman's suffrage, and it was sufficiently plain to us that no methods of education or persuasion would ever prove successful where he was concerned. Therefore the necessity of action on our part was greater than ever. Such an opportunity presented itself at once through changes that took place in the new cabinet. According to English law, all newcomers into the cabinet are obliged to resign their seats in Parliament and offer themselves to their constituencies for re-election. Besides these vacancies there were several others, on account of death or elevations to the peerage. This made necessary a number of by-elections, and the Women's Social and Political Union once more went into the field against the Liberal candidates. I shall deal no further with these by-elections than is necessary to show the effect of our work on the government, and its subsequent effect on our movement, which was to force us into more and more militancy. I shall leave it to the honest judgment of my readers to place where it ought rightly to be placed the responsibility for those first broken windows. We selected as our first candidate for defeat Mr. Winston Churchill, who was about to appeal to his constituency of North West Manchester to sanction his appointment as President of the Board of Trade. My daughter Christabel took charge of this election, and the work of herself and her forces was so successful that Mr. Churchill lost his seat by 420 votes. All the newspapers acknowledged that it was the suffragettes who had defeated Mr. Churchill, and one Liberal newspaper, the London Daily News, called upon the party to put a stop to an intolerable state of affairs by granting the women's demand for votes. Another seat was immediately secured for Mr. Churchill, that of Dundee, then strongly in the merely party sense Liberal, and therefore safe. Nevertheless, we determined to fight Mr. Churchill there, to defeat him if possible, and to bring down the Liberal majority in any case. I took personal charge of the campaign, holding a very large meeting in Kinnaird Hall on the evening before Mr. Churchill's arrival. Although he felt absolutely sure of election in this Scottish constituency, Mr. Churchill dreaded the effect of our presence on the Liberal women. The second meeting he addressed in Dundee was held for women only, and instead of asking for support of the various measures actually on the government's programme, the politician's usual method, he talked about the certainty of securing, within a short time, the parliamentary franchise for women. No one, he declared, can be blind to the fact that at the next general election woman's suffrage will be a real, practical issue, and the next Parliament, I think, ought to see the gratification of the women's claims. I do not exclude the possibility of the suffrage being dealt with in this Parliament. Mr. Churchill earnestly reiterated his claim to be considered a true friend of the women's cause, but when pressed for a pledge that his government would take action, he urged his inability to speak for his colleagues. This specious promise, or rather, prophecy of woman's suffrage at some indefinite time, won over a great many of the Liberal women, who forthwith went staunchly to work for Mr. Churchill's election. Dundee has a large population of extremely poor people, workers in the jute mills and the marmalade factories. Some concessions in the matter of the sugar tax, timely made, and the announcement that the new government meant to establish old age pensions, created an immense wave of Liberal enthusiasm that swept Mr. Churchill into office in spite of our work, which was untiring. We held something like 200 meetings, and on election eve, 5 huge demonstrations, 4 of them in the open air and one which filled a large drill hall. Polling day, May 9th, was very exciting. For every suffragette at the polling booths there were half a dozen Liberal men and women, handing out bills with such legends as "Vote for Churchill," and "Never mind the women," and "Put Churchill in and keep the women out." Yet for all their efforts, Mr. Churchill polled 2,200 votes less than his Liberal predecessor had polled at the general election. In the first 7 by-elections following Mr. Asquith's elevation to the premiership, we succeeded in pulling down the Liberal vote by 66-63. Then something happened to check our progress. Mr. Asquith received a deputation of Liberal members of Parliament, who urged him to allow the Stanger suffrage bill, which had passed its second reading by a large majority, to be carried into law. Mr. Asquith replied that he himself did not wish to see women enfranchised, and that it would not be possible for the government to give the required facilities to Mr. Stanger's bill. He added that he was fully alive to the many defects of the electoral system, and that the government intended, barring accidents, to bring in a reform bill before the close of that Parliament. Woman suffrage would have no place in it, but it would be so worded that a woman suffrage amendment might be added if any member chose to move one. In that case, said Mr. Asquith, he should not consider it the duty of the government to oppose the amendment if it were approved by a majority of the House of Commons, provided that the amendment was on democratic lines, and that it had back of it the support, the strong and undoubted support, of the women of the country as well as the present electorate. One would not suppose that such an evasive utterance as this would be regarded in any quarter as a promise that woman suffrage would be given any real chances of success under the Asquith government. That it was, by many, taken quite seriously is but another proof of the gullibility of the party-blinded public. The Liberal press lauded Mr. Asquith's promise, and called for a truce of militancy in order that the government might have every opportunity to act. Said the Star, in a leader typical of many others, the meaning of Mr. Asquith's pledge is plain. Woman suffrage will be passed through the House of Commons before the present government goes to the country. As for the women's Liberal associations, they were quite delirious with joy. In a conference called for the purpose of passing resolutions of gratitude, Lady Carlisle said, "This is a glorious day of rejoicing. Our great Prime Minister, all honour to him, has opened a way to us by which we can enter into that inheritance from which we have been too long debarred." At the 2 following by-elections, the last of the series, enormous posters were exhibited: Premier's Great Reform Bill, Votes for Women. We tried to tell the electors that the pledge was false on the face of it, that the specious proviso that the amendment be democratic left no doubt that the government would cause the rejection of any practical amendment that might be moved. Our words fell on deaf ears, and the Liberal majorities soared. Just a week later Mr. Asquith was questioned in the House of Commons by a slightly alarmed anti-suffragist member. The member asked Mr. Asquith whether he considered himself pledged to introduce the Reform Bill during that Parliament, whether he meant to allow such a bill to carry a woman suffrage amendment, if such were moved, and whether, in that case, the suffrage amendment would become part of the government policy. Evasive as ever, the Prime Minister, after some sparring, replied, "My honourable friend has asked me a question with regard to a remote and speculative future." Thus was our interpretation of Mr. Asquith's promise justified from his own lips. Yet the Liberal women still clung to the hope of government action, and the Liberal press pretended to cling to it. As for the Women's Social and Political Union, we prepared for more work. We had to strike out along a new line, since it was evident that the government could, for a time at least, neutralize our by-election work by more false promises. Consistent with our policy of never going further than the government compelled us to go, we made our first action a perfectly peaceable one. On the day when the Stanger Bill had reached its second reading in the House, and several days after I had gone to Holloway for the first time, Mr. Herbert Gladstone, the Home Secretary, made a speech which greatly interested the suffragettes. He professed himself a suffragist, and declared that he intended to vote for the bill. Nevertheless, he was confident that it could not pass, because of the division in the Cabinet, and because it had no political party united either for or against it. "Woman suffrage," said Mr. Gladstone, must advance to victory through all the stages that are required for great reforms to mature. First academic discussion, then effective action, was the history of men's suffrage. It must be the same with women's suffrage. Men, declared Mr. Gladstone, have learned this lesson and know the necessity for demonstrating the greatness of their movement, and for establishing that force majeure which actuates and arms a government for effective work. That is the task before the supporters of this great movement. Looking back at the great political crises in the 30s, the 60s, and the 80s, it will be found that the people did not go about in small crowds, nor were they content with enthusiastic meetings in large halls. They assembled in their tens of thousands all over the country. Of course, added Mr. Gladstone, it is not to be expected that women can assemble in such masses, but power belongs to masses, and through this power a government can be influenced into more effective action than a government will be likely to take under present conditions. The Women's Social and Political Union determined to answer this challenge. If assembling in great masses was all that was necessary to convince the government that women's suffrage had passed the academic stage and now demanded political action, we thought we could undertake to satisfy the most skeptical member of the cabinet. We knew that we could organize a demonstration that would outrival any of the great franchise demonstrations held by men in the 30s, 60s, and 80s. The largest number of people ever gathered in Hyde Park was said to have approximated 72,000. We determined to organize a Hyde Park demonstration of at least 250,000 people. Sunday, June 21, 1908, was fixed for the date of this demonstration, and for many months we worked to make it a day notable in the history of the movement. Our example was emulated by the non-militant suffragists, who organized a fine procession of their own, about a week before our demonstration. 13,000 women, it was said, marched in that procession. On our demonstration we spent, for advertising alone, over £1,000, or $5,000. We covered the hoardings of London and of all the principal provincial cities with great posters bearing portraits of the women who were to preside at the 20 platforms from which speeches were to be made, a map of London, showing the routes by which the 7 processions were to advance, and a plan of the Hyde Park meeting place were also shown. London, of course, was thoroughly organized. For weeks a small army of women was busy chalking announcements on sidewalks, distributing handbills, canvassing from house to house, advertising the demonstration by posters and sandwich boards carried through the streets. We invited everybody to be present, including both Houses of Parliament. A few days before the demonstration, Mrs. Drummond and a number of other women hired and decorated a launch and sailed up the Thames to the Houses of Parliament, arriving at the hour when members entertain their women friends at tea on the terrace. Everyone left the tables and crowded to the water's edge as the boat stopped, and Mrs. Drummond's strong, clear voice pealed out her invitation to the Cabinet and the Members of Parliament to join the women's demonstration in Hyde Park. "Come to the park on Sunday," she cried. "You shall have police protection, and there will be no arrests, we promise you." An alarmed someone telephoned for the police boats, but as they appeared, the women's boat steamed away. What a day was Sunday, June 21 st, clear, radiant, filled with golden sunshine. As I advanced, leading, with the Venerable Mrs. Wolstenholme-Elmy, the first of the 7 processions, it seemed to me that all London had turned out to witness our demonstration. And a goodly part of London followed the processions. When I mounted my platform in Hyde Park, and surveyed the mighty throngs that waited there and the endless crowds that were still pouring into the park from all directions, I was filled with amazement not unmixed with awe. Never had I imagined that so many people could be gathered together to share in a political demonstration. It was a gay and beautiful as well as an awe-inspiring spectacle, for the white gowns and flower-trimmed hats of the women, against the background of ancient trees, gave the park the appearance of a vast garden in full bloom. The bugles sounded, and the speakers at each of the 20 platforms began their addresses, which could not have been heard by more than half or a third of the vast audience. Notwithstanding this, they remained to the end. At 5 o'clock the bugles sounded again, the speaking ceased, and the resolution calling upon the government to bring in an official woman suffrage bill without delay was carried at every platform, often without a dissenting vote. Then, with a 3 times repeated cry of votes for women from the assembled multitude, the great meeting dispersed. The London Times said next day, its organisers had counted on an audience of 250,000. That expectation was certainly fulfilled, and probably it was doubled, and it would be difficult to contradict anyone who asserted that it was trebled. Like the distances and the number of the stars, the facts were beyond the threshold of perception. The Daily Express said, "It is probable that so many people never before stood in one square mass anywhere in England." Men who saw the great Gladstone meeting years ago said that compared with yesterday's multitude it was as nothing. We felt that we had answered the challenge in Mr. Gladstone's declaration that power belongs to the masses, and that through this power the government could be influenced, so it was with real hope that we dispatched a copy of the resolution to the Prime Minister, asking him what answer the government would make to that unparalleled gathering of men and women. Mr. Asquith replied formally that he had nothing to add to his previous statement that the government intended, at some indefinite time, to bring in a general reform bill which might be amended to include woman's suffrage. Our wonderful demonstration, it appeared, had made no impression whatever upon him. My Own Story Book 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 3. Now we had reached a point where we had to choose between 2 alternatives. We had exhausted argument. Therefore either we had to give up our agitation altogether, as the suffragists of the 80s virtually had done, or else we must act, and go on acting, until the selfishness and the obstinacy of the government was broken down, or the government themselves destroyed. Until forced to do so, the government, we perceived, would never give women the vote. We realized the truth of John Bright's words, spoken while the Reform Bill of 1867 was being agitated. Parliament, John Bright then declared, had never been hearty for any reform. The Reform Act of 1832 had been wrested by force from the government of that day, and now before another, he said, could be carried, the agitators would have to fill the streets with people from Charing Cross to Westminster Abbey. Acting on John Bright's advice, we issued a call to the public to join us in holding a huge demonstration, on June 30th outside the House of Commons. We wanted to be sure that the government saw as well as read of our immense following. A public proclamation from the Commissioner of Police, warning the public not to assemble in Parliament Square and declaring that the approaches to the Houses of Parliament must be kept open, was at once issued. We persisted in announcing that the demonstration would take place, and I wrote a letter to Mr. Asquith telling him that a deputation would wait upon him at 4:30 on the afternoon of June 30th. We held the usual Women's Parliament in Caxton Hall, after which Mrs. Pettick Lawrence, 11 other women, and myself, set forth. We met with no opposition from the police, but marched through cheering crowds of spectators to the strangers' entrance to the House of Commons. Here we were met by a large group of uniformed men commanded by Inspector Scantlebury, of the police. The inspector, whom I knew personally, stepped forward and demanded officially, "Are you Mrs. Pankhurst, and is this your deputation?" "Yes," I replied. "My orders are to exclude you from the House of Commons." "Has Mr. Asquith received my letter?" I asked. For answer the inspector drew my letter from his pocket and handed it to me. "Did Mr. Asquith return no message, no kind of reply?" I inquired. "No," replied the inspector. We turned and walked back to Caxton Hall, to tell the waiting audience what had occurred. We resolved that there was nothing to do but wait patiently until evening, and see how well the public would respond to our call to meet in Parliament Square. Already we knew that the streets were filled with people, and early as it was the crowds were increasing rapidly. At 8 we went out in groups from Caxton Hall, to find Parliament Square packed with a throng, estimated next day at least 100,000. From the steps of public buildings, from stone copings, From the iron railings of the palace yard, to which they clung precariously, our women made speeches until the police pulled them down and flung them into the moving, swaying, excited crowds. Some of the women were arrested, others were merely ordered to move on. Mingled cheers and jeers rose from the spectators. Some of the men were roughs who had come out to amuse themselves. Others were genuinely sympathetic, and tried valiantly to help us to reach the House of Commons. Again and again the police lines were broken, and it was only as the result of repeated charges by mounted police that the people's attacks were repelled. Many members of Parliament, including Mr. Lloyd George, Mr. Winston Churchill, and Mr. Herbert Gladstone, came out to witness the struggle, which lasted until midnight and resulted in the arrest of 29 women. 2 of these women were arrested after they had each thrown a stone through a window of Mr. Asquith's official residence in Downing Street, the value of the windows being about $2.40. This was the first window breaking in our history. Mrs. Mary Lee and Miss Edith New, who had thrown the stones, sent word to me from the police court that, having acted without orders, they would not resent repudiation from headquarters. Far from repudiating them, I went at once to see them in their cells, and assured them of my approval of their act. The smashing of windows is a time-honored method of showing displeasure in a political situation. As one of the newspapers, commenting on the affair, truly said, "When the King and Queen dine at Apsley on the 13th inst, they will be entertained in rooms the windows of which the Duke of Wellington was obliged to protect with iron shutters from the fury of his political opponents." In Winchester a few years ago, to give but one instance, a great riot took place as a protest against the removal of a historic gun from one part of the town to another. In the course of this riot windows were broken and other property of various kinds was destroyed, very serious damage being done. No punishment was administered in respect of this riot, and the authorities, bowing to public opinion thus riotously expressed, restored the gun to its original situation. Window breaking, when Englishmen do it, is regarded as honest expression of political opinion. Window breaking, when Englishwomen do it, is treated as a crime. In sentencing Mrs. Lee and Miss New to 2 months in the First Division, the magistrate used very severe language, and declared that such a thing must never happen again. Of course the women assured him that it would happen again. Said Mrs. Lee, "We have no other course but to rebel against oppression, and if necessary to resort to stronger measures." This fight is going on. The summer of 1908 is remembered as one of the most oppressively hot seasons the country had known for years. Our prisoners in Holloway suffered intensely, some being made desperately ill from the heat, the bad air, and the miserable food. We who spent the summer campaigning suffered also, but in less degree. It was a tremendous relief when the cool days of autumn set in, and it was with renewed vigour that we prepared for the opening day of Parliament, which was October 12th. Again we resolved to send a deputation to the Prime Minister, and again we invited the general public to take part in the demonstration. We had printed thousands of little handbills bearing this inscription: "Men and women, help the suffragettes to rush the House of Commons, on Tuesday evening, October 13th, at 7:30. On Sunday, October 11th, we held a large meeting in Trafalgar Square, my daughter Christabel, Mrs. Drummond, and I speaking from the plinth of the Nelson Monument. Mr. Lloyd George, as we afterward learned, was a member of the audience. The police were there, taking ample notes of our speeches. We had not failed to notice that they were watching us daily, dogging our footsteps, and showing in numerous ways that they were under orders to keep track of all our movements. The climax came at noon on October 12th, when Christabel, Mrs. Drummond and I were each served with an imposing legal document which read, "Information has been laid this day by the Commissioner of Police that you, in the month of October, in the year 1908, were guilty of conduct likely to provoke a breach of the peace by initiating and causing to be initiated, by publishing and causing to be published, a certain handbill, calling upon and inciting the public to do a certain wrongful and illegal act, viz., to rush the House of Commons at 7:30 p.m. on October 13 INST. The last paragraph was a summons to appear at Bow Street Police Station that same afternoon at 3 o'clock. We did not go to Bow Street Police Station. We went instead to a crowded at-home at Queen's Hall, where it can be imagined that our news created great excitement. The place was surrounded by constables, and the police reporters were on hand to take stenographic reports of everything that was said from the platform. Once an excited cry was raised that a police inspector was coming in to arrest us. But the officer merely brought a message that the summons had been adjourned until the following morning. It did not suit our convenience to obey the adjourned summons quite so early, so I wrote a polite note to the police, saying that we would be in our headquarters, number 4 Clement's Inn, the next evening at 6 o'clock, and would then be at his disposal. Warrants for our arrests were quickly issued, and Inspector Jarvis was instructed to execute them at once. This he found impossible to do, for Mrs. Drummond was spending her last day of liberty on private business, while my daughter and I had retreated to another part of Clement's Inn, which is a big, rambling building. There, in the roof garden of the Pethick Lawrence's private flat, we remained all day, busy, under the soft blue of the autumn sky, with our work and our preparations for a long absence. At 6 we walked downstairs, dressed for the street. Mrs. Drummond arrived promptly, the waiting officers read the warrants, and we all proceeded to Bow Street in cabs. It was too late for the trial to be held. We asked for bail, but the authorities had no mind to allow us to take part in the rush which we had incited, so we were obliged to spend the night in the police station. All night I lay awake, thinking of the scenes which were going on in the streets. The next morning, in a courtroom crowded to its utmost capacity, my daughter rose to conduct her first case at law. She had earned the right to an LLB after her name, but as women are not permitted to practice law in England, she had never appeared at the bar in any capacity except that of defendant. Now she proposed to combine the two roles of defendant and lawyer, and conduct the case for the three of us. She began by asking the magistrate not to try the case in that court, but to send it for trial before a judge and jury. We had long desired to take the suffragettes' cases before bodies of private citizens, because we had every reason to suspect that the police court officials acted under the direct commands of the very persons against whom our agitation was directed. Jury trial was denied us, but after the preliminary examination was over, the magistrate, Mr. Curtis Bennett, allowed a week's adjournment for preparation of the case. On October 21 the trial was resumed, with the courtroom as full as before and the press table even more crowded, for it had been widely published that we had actually subpoenaed 2 members of the government, who had witnessed the scenes on the night of October 13. The first witness to enter the box was Mr. Lloyd George. Christable examined him at some length as to the meaning and merits of the word rush, and succeeded in making him very uncomfortable and the charge against ourselves look very flimsy. She then questioned him about the speeches he had heard at Trafalgar Square, and as to whether there had been any suggestion that property be destroyed or personal violence used. He admitted that the speeches were temperate and the crowds orderly. Then Christable suddenly asked, "There were no words used so likely to incite to violence as the advice you gave at Swansea, that the women should be ruthlessly flung out of your meeting?" Mr. Lloyd George looked black, and answered nothing. The magistrate hastened to the protection of Mr. Lloyd George. "This is quite irrelevant," he said. "That was a private meeting." "It was a public meeting, and Christable said so." "It was a private meeting in a sense," insisted the magistrate. Mr. Lloyd George assumed an air of pompous indignation when Christable asked him, "Have we not received encouragement from you, and if not from you, from your colleagues, to take action of this kind?" Mr. Lloyd George rolled his eyes upward as he replied, "I should be very much surprised to hear that, Miss Pankhurst." "Is it not a fact," asked Christable, "that you yourself have set us an example of revolt?" "I never incited a crowd to violence," exclaimed the witness. "Not in the Welsh graveyard case?" she asked. "No," he cried angrily. You did not tell them to break down a wall and disinter a body, pursued Christable. He could not deny this, but I gave advice which was found by the Court of Appeal to be sound legal advice, he snapped, and turned his back as far as he could in the narrow witness box. Mr. Herbert Gladstone had asked to be allowed to testify early, as he was being detained from important public duties. Christable asked to question one witness before Mr. Gladstone entered the box. The witness was Miss Georgiana Brackenbury, who had recently suffered 6 weeks' imprisonment for the cause, and had since met and had a talk with Mr. Horace Smith, the magistrate, who had made to her a most important and damaging admission of the government's interference in suffragists' trials. Christable asked her one question. Did Mr. Horace Smith tell you in sentencing you that he was doing what he had been told to do? You must not put that question, exclaimed the magistrate. But the witness had already answered yes. There was an excited stir in the courtroom. It had been recorded under oath that a magistrate had admitted that suffragettes were being sentenced not by himself, according to the evidence and according to law, but by the government, for no one could possibly doubt where Mr. Horace Smith's orders came from. Mr. Gladstone, plump, bald, and ruddy, in no way resembles his illustrious father. He entered the witness box smiling and confident, but his complacence vanished when Christable asked him outright if the government had not ordered the Commissioner of Police to take this action against us. Of course the magistrate intervened, and Mr. Gladstone did not answer the question. Christable tried again. Did you instruct Mr. Horace Smith to decide against Miss Brackenbury, and to send her to prison for 6 weeks? That too was objected to, as were all questions on the subject. All through the examination the magistrate constantly intervened to save the cabinet minister from embarrassment, but Christable finally succeeded in making Mr. Gladstone admit, point by point, that he had said that women could never get the vote because they could not fight for it as men had fought. A large number of witnesses testified to the orderly nature of the demonstration on the 13th, and then Christable rose to plead. She began by declaring that these proceedings had been taken, as the legal saying is, in malice and vexation, in order to lame a political enemy. She declared that, under the law, the charge which might properly be brought against us was that of illegal assembly, but the government had not charged us with this offense, because the government desired to keep the case in a police court. The authorities dare not see this case come before a jury, she declared, because they know perfectly well that if it were heard before a jury of our countrymen we should be acquitted, just as John Burns was acquitted years ago for taking action far more dangerous to the public peace than we have taken. We are deprived of trial by jury. We are also deprived of the right to appeal against the magistrate's decision. Very carefully has this procedure been thought out. Of the handbill she said, we do not deny that we issued this bill. None of us three has wished to deny responsibility. We did issue the bill, we did cause it to be circulated, we did put upon it the words "Come and help the suffragettes rush the House of Commons." For these words we do not apologize. It is very well known that we took this action in order to press forward a claim, which, according to the British Constitution, we are well entitled to make. In all that the suffragettes had done, in all that they might ever do, declared my daughter, they would only be following in the footsteps of men now in Parliament. Mr. Herbert Gladstone has told us in the speech I read to him that the victory of argument alone is not enough. As we cannot hope to win by force of argument alone, it is necessary to overcome by other means the savage resistance of the government to our claim for citizenship. He says, "Go on, fight as the men did." And then, when we show our power and get the people to help us, he takes proceedings against us in a manner that would have been disgraceful even in the old days of coercion. Then there is Mr. Lloyd George, who, if any man has done so, has set us an example. His whole career has been a series of revolts. He has said that if we do not get the vote, mark these words, we should be justified in adopting the methods the men had to adopt, namely, pulling down the Hyde Park railings. She quoted Lord Morley as saying of the Indian unrest, We are in India in the presence of a living movement, and a movement for what? For objects which we ourselves have taught them to think are desirable objects, and unless we can somehow reconcile order with satisfaction of those ideals and aspirations, the fault will not be theirs, it will be ours. It will mark the breakdown of British statesmanship. Apply those words to our case, she continued. Remember that we are demanding of liberal statesmen that which is for us the greatest boon and the most essential right, and if the present government cannot reconcile order with our demand for the vote without delay, it will mark the breakdown of their statesmanship. Yes, their statesmanship has broken down already. They are disgraced. It is only in this court that they have the smallest hope of being supported. My daughter had spoken with passion and fervor, and her righteous indignation had moved her to words that caused the magistrate's face to turn an angry crimson. When I rose to address the court, I began by assuming an appearance of calmness which I did not altogether feel. I endorsed all that Christable had said of the unfairness of our trial and the malice of the government. I protested against the trial of political offenders in a common police court, and I said that we were not women who would come into the court as ordinary lawbreakers. I described Mrs. Drummond's worthy career as a wife, a mother, and a self-sustaining businesswoman. I said, before you decide what is to be done with us, I should like you to hear from me a statement of what has brought me into the dock this morning. And then I told of my life and experiences, many of which I have related in these pages, of what I had seen and known as a poor law guardian and a registrar of births and deaths, of how I had learned the burning necessity of changing the status of women, of altering the laws under which they and their children live, and of the essential justice of making women self-governing citizens. I have seen, I said, that men are encouraged by law to take advantage of the helplessness of women. Many women have thought as I have, and for many, many years have tried, by that influence of which we have been so often reminded, to alter these laws, but we find that influence counts for nothing. When we went to the House of Commons, we used to be told, when we were persistent, that members of Parliament were not responsible to women, they were responsible only to voters, and that their time was too fully occupied to reform those laws, although they agreed that they needed reforming. We women have presented larger petitions in support of our enfranchisement than were ever presented for any other reform. We have succeeded in holding greater public meetings than men have ever held for any reform, in spite of the difficulty which women have in throwing off their natural diffidence, that desire to escape publicity which we have inherited from generations of our foremothers. We have broken through that. We have faced hostile mobs at street corners, because we were told that we could not have that representation for our taxes that men have won unless we converted the whole of the country to our side. Because we have done this, we have been misrepresented, we have been ridiculed, we have had contempt poured upon us, and the ignorant mob have been incited to offer us violence, which we have faced unarmed and unprotected by the safeguards which cabinet ministers enjoy. We have been driven to do this. We are determined to go on with this agitation because we feel in honor bound. Just as it was the duty of your forefathers, it is our duty to make the world a better place for women than it is today. Lastly, I want to call attention to the self-restraint which was shown by our followers on the night of the 13th, after we had been arrested. Our rule has always been to be patient, exercise self-restraint, show our so-called superiors that we are not hysterical, to use no violence, but rather to offer ourselves to the violence of others. That is all I have to say to you, sir. We are here, not because we are lawbreakers, we are here in our efforts to become lawmakers. The burly policemen, the reporters, and most of the spectators were in tears as I finished. But the magistrate, who had listened part of the time with his hand concealing his face, still held that we were properly charged in a common police court as inciters to riot. Since we refused to be bound over to keep the peace, he sentenced Mrs. Drummond and myself to 3 months' imprisonment, and Christable to 10 weeks' imprisonment. It was destined to be a kind of imprisonment the authorities had never yet been called upon to deal with. My Own Story Book 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 4. My first act on reaching Holloway was to demand that the governor be sent for. When he came, I told him that the suffragettes had resolved that they would no longer submit to being treated as ordinary lawbreakers. In the course of our trial, 2 cabinet ministers had admitted that we were political offenders, and therefore we should henceforth refuse to be searched or to undress in the presence of the wardresses. For myself, I claimed the right, and I hoped the others would do likewise, to speak to my friends during exercise, or whenever I came in contact with them. The governor, after reflection, yielded to the first 2 demands, but said that he would have to consult the Home Office before permitting us to break the rule of silence. We were accordingly allowed to change our clothing privately, and, as a further concession, were placed in adjoining cells. This was little advantage to me, however, since within a few days I was removed to a hospital cell, suffering from the illness which prison life always inflicts on me. Here the governor visited me with the unwelcome news that the Home Secretary had refused to allow me the privilege of speech with my fellow prisoners. I asked him if I might, when I was strong enough to walk, take exercise with my friends. To this he assented, and I soon had the joy of seeing my daughter and the other brave comrades, and walking with them in the dismal courtyard of the prison. Single file we walked, at a distance of 3 or 4 feet from one another, back and forth under the stony eyes of the wardresses. The rough flags of the pavement hurt our feet, shod in heavy, shapeless prison boots. The autumn days were cold and cheerless, and we shivered violently under our scanty cloaks. But of all our hardships, the ceaseless silence of our lives was worst. At the end of the 2nd week, I decided I would no longer endure it. That afternoon at exercise, I suddenly called my daughter by name and bade her stand still until I came up to her. Of course she stopped, and when I reached her side we linked arms and began to talk in low tones. A wardress ran up to us, saying, "I shall listen to everything you say." I replied, "You are welcome to do that, but I shall insist on my right to speak to my daughter." Another wardress had hastily left the yard, and now she returned with a large number of wardresses. They seized me and quickly removed me to my cell, while the other suffrage prisoners cheered my action at the top of their voices. For their mutiny they got 3 days solitary confinement, and I, for mine, a much more severe punishment. Unrepentant, I told the governor that, in spite of any punishment he might impose on me, I would never again submit to the silence rule. To forbid a mother to speak to her daughter was infamous. For this I was characterized as a dangerous criminal and was sent into solitary confinement, without exercise or chapel, while a wardress was stationed constantly at my cell door to see that I communicated with no one. It was 2 weeks before I saw any of my friends again, and meantime the health of Mrs. Drummond had been so seriously impaired that she was released for hospital treatment. My daughter also, I learned, was ill, and in desperation I made application to the Board of Visiting Magistrates to be allowed to see her. After a long conference, during which I was made to wait outside in the corridor, the magistrates returned a refusal, saying that I might renew my application in a month. The answer then, they said, would depend on my conduct. A month. My girl might be dead by that time. My anxiety sent me to bed ill again, but, although I did not know it, relief was already on its way. I had told the visiting magistrates that I would wait until public opinion got within those walls, and this happened sooner than I had dared to hope. Mrs. Drummond, as soon as she was able to appear in public, and the other suffrage prisoners, as they were released, spread broadcast the story of our mutiny, and of a subsequent one led by Miss Wallace Dunlop, which sent a large number of women into solitary confinement. The suffragettes marched by thousands to Holloway, thronging the approaches to the prison street. Round and round the prison they marched, singing the women's Marseillaise and cheering. Faintly the sound came to our ears, infinitely lightening our burden of pain and loneliness. The following week they came again, so we afterwards learned, but this time the police turned them back long before they reached the confines of the prison. The demonstrations, together with a volley of questions asked in the House of Commons, told at last. Orders came from the Home Office that I was to see my daughter, and that we were to be allowed to exercise and to talk together for 1 hour each day. In addition, we were to be permitted the rare privilege of reading a daily newspaper. Then, on December 8th, the day of Christabel's release, orders came that I, too, should be discharged, 2 weeks before the expiration of my sentence. At the welcome breakfast given us, as released prisoners, at Lincoln's Inn Hotel, I told our members that henceforth we should all insist on refusing to abide by ordinary prison rules. We did not propose to break laws and then shirk punishment. We simply meant to assert our right to be recognized as political prisoners. We reached this point after due reflection. We first set ourselves not to complain of prison, not to say anything about it, to avoid it, to keep away from all side issues, to keep along the straight path of political reform, to get the vote, because we knew that when we had won it we could reform prisons and a great many other abuses as well. But now that we had had in the witness box the admission of cabinet ministers that we are political offenders, we should in future demand the treatment given to men political offenders in all civilized countries. If nations, I said, are still so governed that they make political offenders, then Great Britain is going to treat her political offenders as well as political offenders are treated by other nations. If it were the custom to treat political offenders as ordinary offenders against the well-being of society are treated, we should not have complained if we were treated like that, but it is not the international custom to do it, and so, for the dignity of the women of the country, and for the sake of the consciences of the men of the country, and for the sake of our nation amongst the nations of the earth, we are not going to allow the Liberal government to treat us like ordinary lawbreakers. In future. I said the same thing that night in a great meeting held in Queen's Hall to welcome the released prisoners, and, although we all knew that our determination involved a bitter struggle, our women endorsed it without a moment's hesitation. Had they been able to look forward to the events which were even then overshadowing us, could they have foreseen the new forms of suffering and danger that lay in waiting, I am certain that they would still have done the same thing, for our experiences had taught us to dispense with fear. Whatever of timidity, of shrinking from pain or hardship any of us had originally possessed, it had all vanished. There were no terrors that we were not now ready to face. The year 1909 marks an important point in our struggle, partly because of this decision of ours, never again to submit to be classed with criminals, and partly because in this year we forced the Liberal government to go on record, publicly, in regard to the oldest of popular rights, the right of petition. We had long contemplated this step, and now the time seemed ripe for taking it. In the closing days of 1908 Mr. Asquith, speaking on the policy to be carried out in 1909, commented on the various deputations he was obliged at that time to receive. They called on him, he said, from all quarters and in all causes, on an average of something like 2 hours on 3 days in every week. The deputations all asked for different things, and, although all of the things could not possibly be included in the King's speech, Mr. Asquith was inclined to agree that many of them ought to be included. This declaration from the Prime Minister that he was constantly receiving deputations of men, and listening favourably to their suggestions of what policies to pursue, aroused in the suffragettes feelings of deep indignation. This in part they expressed on January 25, when the first meeting of the Cabinet Council took place. A small deputation from the WSPU proceeded to Downing Street to claim the right to be heard, as men were heard. For knocking at the door of the official residence 4 of the women, including my sister, Mrs. Clark, were arrested and sent to prison for 1 month. A month later the 7th of our Women's Parliaments was called against this and against the fact that no mention of women had been included in the King's speech. Led by Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, Lady Constance Lytton and Miss Daisy Solomon, a deputation of women endeavoured to carry the resolution to the House of Commons. They were promptly arrested and, next day, were sent to prison on sentences of from 1 to 2 months. The time was rapidly approaching when the legality of these arrests would have to be tested. In June of the year 1909 the test was made. It will be remembered that we had endeavored to force the authorities to make good their threat to charge us under the obsolete Charles II Tumultuous Petitions Act, which prescribes severe penalties for persons proceeding to Parliament in groups of more than 12 for the purpose of presenting petitions. It had been stated that if we were charged under that act, our case would be given a hearing before a judge and jury instead of a police magistrate. Since this was exactly what we desired to have happen, we had sent deputation after deputation of more than 12 persons, but always they were tried in police courts, and were sent to prison often for periods as long as that prescribed in the Charles II Act. Now we determined to do something still more ambitious. We resolved to test, not the Charles II Act, but the constitutional right of the subject to petition the Prime Minister as the seat of power. The right of petition, which has existed in England since the earliest known period, was written into the Bill of Rights which became law in 1689 on the accession of William and Mary. It was, in fact, one of the conditions attaching to the accession of the joint monarchs. According to the Bill of Rights, it is the right of subjects to petition the king, and all commitments and prosecutions for such petitionings are illegal. The power of the king having passed almost completely into the hands of Parliament, the Prime Minister now stands where the King's Majesty stood in former times. Clearly, then, the right of the subject to petition the Prime Minister cannot be legally denied. Thus were we advised, and in order to keep within the strict letter of the law, we accepted the limitations of the right of petition laid down in the Charles II Act, and decided that our petition should be carried to the House of Commons by small groups of women. Again I called together, on the evening of June 29, a Parliament of women. Previously I had written to Mr. Asquith stating that a deputation of women would wait on him at the House of Commons at 8 o'clock in the evening. I wrote him further that we were not to be refused, as we insisted upon our constitutional right to be received. To my note the Prime Minister returned a formal note declining to receive us. Nevertheless we continued our preparations, because we knew that the Prime Minister would continue to decline, but that in the end he would be forced to receive us. An incident which occurred a week before the date of the deputation was destined to have important consequences. Miss Wallace Dunlop went to St. Stephen's Hall in the House of Commons, and marked with printer's ink on the stonework of the hall an extract from the Bill of Rights. The first time she made the attempt she was interrupted by a policeman, but 2 days later she succeeded in stamping on the ancient walls the reminder to Parliament that women as well as men possess constitutional rights, and that they were proposing to exercise those rights. She was arrested and sentenced to prison for 1 month, in the 3rd Division. The option of a heavy fine was given her, which of course she refused. Miss Wallace Dunlop's prison term began on June 22d. Perhaps her deed had something to do with the unusual interest taken in the approaching deputation, an interest which was shown not only by the public but by many members of Parliament. In the House of Commons a strong feeling that the women ought this time to be received manifested itself in many questions put to the government. One member even asked leave to move the adjournment of the House on a matter of urgent public importance, namely the danger to the public peace, owing to the refusal of the Prime Minister to receive the deputation. This was denied, however, and the government mendaciously disclaimed all responsibility for what action the police might take toward the deputation. The Home Secretary, Mr. Gladstone, when asked by Mr. Keir Hardie to give instructions that the deputation, if orderly, should be admitted to St. Stephen's, replied, "I cannot say what action the police ought to take in the matter." Our Women's Parliament met at 7:30 on the evening of June 29, and the petition to the Prime Minister was read and adopted. Then our deputation set forth. Accompanying me as leader were 2 highly respectable women of advanced years, Mrs. Saul Solomon, whose husband had been Prime Minister at the Cape, and Miss Nelligan, one of the foremost of the pioneer educators of England. We 3 and 5 other women were preceded by Miss Elsie Howie, who, riding fast, went on horseback to announce our coming to the enormous crowds that filled the streets. She, we afterward learned, progressed as far as the approaches to the House of Commons before being turned back by the police. As for the deputation, it pressed on through the crowd as far as St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, where we found a long line of police blocking the road. We paused for a moment, gathering strength for the ordeal of trying to push through the lines, when an unexpected thing happened. An order was given from someone, and instantly the police lines parted, leaving a clear space through which we walked towards the house. We were escorted on our way by Inspector Wells, and as we passed the crowd broke into vociferous cheering, firmly believing that we were after all to be received. As for myself, I did little speculating as to what was about to happen. I simply led my deputation on as far as the entrance to St. Stephen's Hall. There we encountered another strong force of police commanded by our old acquaintance, Inspector Scantlebury, who stepped forward and handed me a letter. I opened it and read in aloud to the women. The Prime Minister, for the reasons which he has already given in a written reply to their request, regrets that he is unable to receive the proposed deputation. I dropped the note to the ground and said, I stand upon my rights, as a subject of the King, to petition the Prime Minister, and I am firmly resolved to stand here until I am received. Inspector Scantlebury turned away and walked rapidly towards the door of the stranger's entrance. I turned to Inspector Jarvis, who remained, to several members of Parliament and some newspaper men who stood looking on, and begged them to take my message to the Prime Minister, but no one responded, and the inspector, seizing my arm, began to push me away. I now knew that the deputation would not be received and that the old miserable business of refusing to leave, of being forced backward, and returning again and again until arrested, would have to be reenacted. I had to take into account that I was accompanied by two fragile old ladies, who, brave as they were to be there at all, could not possibly endure what I knew must follow. I quickly decided that I should have to force an immediate arrest, so I committed an act of technical assault on the person of Inspector Jarvis, striking him very lightly on the cheek. He said instantly, I understand why you did that, and I supposed then that we would instantly be taken. But the other police apparently did not grasp the situation, for they began pushing and jostling our women. I said to the inspector, shall I have to do it again? And he said yes. So I struck him lightly a second time, and then he ordered the police to make the arrests. The matter did not end with the arrest of our deputation of 8 women. In recurring deputations of 12, the suffragettes again and again pressed forward in vain endeavour to reach the House of Commons. In spite of the fact that the crowds were friendly and did everything they could to aid the women, their deputations were broken up by the police and many of the women arrested. By 9 o'clock Parliament Square was empty, an enormous force of mounted police having beaten the people back into Victoria Street and across Westminster Bridge. For a short time all looked tranquil, but soon little groups of women, 7 or 8 at a time, kept appearing mysteriously and making spirited dashes toward the house. This extraordinary procedure greatly exasperated the police, who could not unravel the mystery of where the women came from. As a matter of bygone history, the explanation is that the WSPU had hired 30 offices in the neighborhood, in the shelter of which the women waited until it was time for them to sally forth. It was a striking demonstration of the ingenuity of women opposing the physical force of men, but it served still another purpose. It diverted the attention of the police from another demonstration which was going on. Other suffragettes had gone to the official residence of the First Lord of the Admiralty, to the Home Office, the Treasury and Privy Council offices, and had registered their contempt for the government's refusal to receive the deputation by the time-honored method of breaking a window in each place. 108 women were arrested that night, but instead of submitting to arrests and trial, the Women's Social and Political Union announced that they were prepared to prove that the government and not the women had broken the law in refusing to receive the petition. My case, coupled with that of the Honourable Mrs. Haverfield, was selected as a test case for all the others, and Lord Robert Cecil was retained for the defence. Mr. Musket, who conducted the case for the prosecution, tried to prove that our women had not gone to the House of Commons to present a petition, but this was easily demonstrated to be an unwarranted claim. The speeches of the leader, the official articles published in our newspaper, Votes for Women, and the letters sent to Mr. Asquith, not to speak of the indisputable facts that every member of the deputation carried a copy of the petition in her hand, furnished evidence enough of the nature of our errand. The whole case of the subject's right of petition was then brought forward for discussion. Mr. Musket spoke first, then our counsel, Mr. Henley, then Lord Robert Cecil. Last of all I spoke, describing the events of June 29. I told the magistrate that should he decide that we and not the government had been guilty of an infraction of the law, we should refuse to be bound over, but should all choose to go to prison. In that case we should not submit to being treated like criminals. There are 108 of us here today, I said, pointing to the benches where my fellow prisoners sat, and just as we have thought it is our duty to defy the police in the street, so when we get into prison, as we are political prisoners, we shall do our best to bring back into the 20th century the treatment of political prisoners which was thought right in the case of William Cobbett, and other political offenders of his time. The magistrate, Sir Albert de Rutzen, an elderly, amiable man, rather bewildered by this unprecedented situation, then gave his decision. He agreed with Mr. Henley and Lord Robert Cecil that the right of petition was clearly guaranteed to every subject, but he thought that when the women were refused permission to enter the House of Commons, and when Mr. Asquith had said that he would not receive them, the women acted wrongly to persist in their demands. He should, therefore, fine them £5 each, or sentence them to prison for 1 month in the 2nd Division. The sentence would be suspended for the present until learned counsel could obtain a decision from a higher court on the legal point of the right of petition. I then put in a claim for all the prisoners, and asked that all their cases might be held over until the test case was decided, and this was agreed to, except in regard to 14 women charged with window breaking. They were tried separately and sent to prison on sentences varying from 6 weeks to 2 months. Of them later. The appeal against Sir Albert de Rutzen's decision was tried in a divisional court early in December of that year. Lord Robert Cecil again appeared for the defence, and in a masterly piece of argumentation, contended that in England there was and always had been the right of petition, and that the right had always been considered a necessary condition of a free country and a civilized government. The right of petition, he pointed out, had 3 characteristics. In the first place, it was the right to petition the actual repositories of power. In the second place, it was the right to petition in person. And in the third place, the right must be exercised reasonably. A long list of historical precedents were offered in support of the right to petition in person, but Lord Robert argued that even if these did not exist, the right was admitted in the Charles II Tumultuous Petitions Act, which provides that no person or persons whatsoever shall repair to His Majesty or both or either Houses of Parliament upon pretence of presenting or delivering any petition, complaint, remonstrance, or declaration or other address, accompanied with excessive number of people, etc. The Bill of Rights had specially confirmed the right of petition in so far as the King personally was concerned. The women, pursued Lord Robert, had gone to Parliament Square on June 29 in the exercise of a plain constitutional right, and that in going there with a petition they had acted according to the only constitutional method they possessed, being voteless, for the redress of their grievances. If then it were true, as contended, the subject not only possessed the right to petition, but to petition in person, the only point to be considered was whether the right had been exercised reasonably. If persons desired to interview the Prime Minister, it was surely reasonable to go to the House of Commons, and to present themselves at the stranger's entrance. Mrs. Pankhurst, Mrs. Haverfield, and the others had, as the evidence showed, proceeded along the public highway and had been escorted to the door of the House of Commons by an officer of the police, and could not therefore, up to that point, have been acting in an unlawful manner. The police had kept clear a large open space opposite the House of Commons, the crowd being kept at a certain distance away. Within the open space there were only persons having business in the House of Commons, members of the police force and the 8 women who formed the deputation. It could not possibly be contended that these 8 women had caused an obstruction. It was true that a police officer told them that the Prime Minister was not in the House of Commons, but when one desired an interview with a Member of Parliament, one did not make his request of a casual policeman in the street. Moreover, the police did not possess any authority to stop anyone from going into the House of Commons. The letter given the women, in which the Prime Minister said that he could not or would not see them, had been cited. Now, had the Prime Minister, in his letter, said that he could not or would not see the women at that time, that the time was not convenient, but that he would at some future time, at a more convenient time, receive them, that would have been a sufficient answer. The women would not have been justified in refusing to accept such an answer, because the right to petition must be exercised reasonably. But the letter contained an unqualified refusal, and that, if we allow the right of petition to exist, was no answer at all. Last of all, Lord Robert argued that if there is a right to petition a Member of Parliament, then it must be incumbent on the part of a Member of Parliament to receive the petition, and that no one has a right to interfere with the petitioner. If the 8 women were legally justified in presenting their petition, then they were also justified in refusing to obey the orders of the police to leave the place. In an address full of bias, and revealing plainly that he had no accurate knowledge of any of the events that had led up to the case in hand, the Lord Chief Justice delivered judgment. He said that he entirely agreed with Lord Robert Cecil as to the right to present a petition to the Prime Minister, either as Prime Minister or as a Member of Parliament, and he agreed also that petitions to the King should be presented to the Prime Minister. But the claim of the women, he said, was not merely to present a petition, but to be received in a deputation. He did not think it likely that Mr. Asquith would have refused to receive a petition from the women, but his refusal to receive the deputation was not unnatural, in consequence of what we know did happen on previous occasions. Referring to the Metropolitan Police Act of 1839, which provides that it shall be lawful for the Commissioner of Police to make regulations and to give instructions to the Constable for keeping order, and for preventing any obstruction of thoroughfares in the immediate neighbourhood of the House of Commons, and the sessional order empowering the police to keep clear the approaches to the House of Commons, the Lord Chief Justice decided that I and the other women were guilty of an infraction of the law when we insisted on a right to enter the House of Commons. The Lord Chief Justice therefore ruled that our conviction in the lower court had been proper, and our appeal was dismissed with costs. Thus was destroyed in England the ancient constitutional right of petition, secured to the people by the Bill of Rights, and cherished by uncounted generations of Englishmen. I say the right was destroyed, for of how much value is a petition which cannot be presented in person? The decision of the High Court was appalling to the members of the WSPU, as it closed the last approach, by constitutional means, to our enfranchisement. Far from discouraging or disheartening us, it simply spurred us on to new and more aggressive forms of militancy. Footnote: Mr. Asquith had never, since becoming Prime Minister, received a deputation of women, nor had he ever received a deputation of the WSPU. So it was absurd of the Lord Chief Justice to speak of what did happen, on previous occasions. My Own Story Book 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 5. Between the time of the arrest in June and the handing down of the absurd decision of the Lord Chief Justice that although we, as subjects, possessed the right of petition, yet we had committed an offence in exercising that right, nearly 6 months had passed. In that interval certain grave developments had lifted the militant movement onto a new and more heroic plane. It will be remembered that a week before our deputation to test the Charles II Act, Miss Wallace Dunlop had been sent to prison for 1 month for stamping an extract from the Bill of Rights on the stone walls of St. Stephen's Hall. On arriving at Holloway on Friday evening, July 2nd, she sent for the governor and demanded of him that she be treated as a political offender. The governor replied that he had no power to alter the sentence of the magistrate, whereupon Miss Wallace Dunlop informed him that it was the unalterable resolution of the suffragettes never again to submit to the prison treatment given to ordinary offenders against the law. Therefore she should, if placed in the second division as a common criminal, refuse to touch food until the government yielded her point. It is hardly likely that the government or the prison authorities realized the seriousness of Miss Wallace Dunlop's action, or the heroic mold of the suffragette's character. At all events, the Home Secretary paid no attention to the letter sent him by the prisoner, in which she explained simply but clearly her motives for her desperate act, and the prison authorities did nothing except seek means of breaking down her resistance. The ordinary prison diet was replaced by the most tempting food, and this, instead of being brought to her cell at intervals, was kept there night and day, but always untouched. Several times daily the doctor came to feel her pulse and observe her growing weakness. The doctor, as well as the governor and the wardresses, argued, coaxed, and threatened, but without effect. The week passed without any sign of surrender on the part of the prisoner. On Friday the doctor reported that she was rapidly reaching a point at which death might at any time supervene. Hurried conferences were carried on between the prison and the Home Office, and that evening, June 8, Miss Wallace Dunlop was sent home, having served 1/4 of her sentence, and having ignored completely all the terms of her imprisonment. On the day of her release, the 14 women who had been convicted of window breaking received their sentences, and learning of Miss Wallace Dunlop's act, they, as they were being taken to Holloway in the prison van, held a consultation and agreed to follow her example. Arrived at Holloway, they at once informed the officials that they would not give up any of their belongings, neither would they put on prison clothing, perform prison labor, eat prison food, or keep the rule of silence. The governor agreed for the moment to allow them to retain their property and to wear their own clothing, but he told them that they had committed an act of mutiny and that he would have to so charge them at the next visit of the magistrates. The women then addressed petitions to the Home Secretary, demanding that they be given the prison treatment universally allowed political offenders. They decided to postpone the hunger strike until the Home Secretary had had time to reply. Meanwhile, after a vain appeal for more fresh air, for the weather was stiflingly hot, the women committed one more act of mutiny. They broke the windows of their cells. We learned this from the prisoners themselves. Several days after they had gone to prison, my daughter Christabel and Mrs. Tuke, filled with anxiety for their fate, gained admission to an upper-story room of a house overlooking the prison. Calling at the top of their voices and waving a flag of the Union, they succeeded in attracting the prisoners' attention. The women thrust their arms through the broken panes, waving handkerchiefs, votes for women badges, anything they could get hold of, and in a few shouted words told their tale. That same day the visiting magistrates arrived, and the mutineers were sentenced to terms of 7 to 10 days of solitary confinement in the punishment cells. In these frightful cells, dark, unclean, dripping with moisture, the prisoners resolutely hunger-struck. At the end of 5 days one of the women was reduced to such a condition that the Home Secretary ordered her released. The next day several more were released, and before the end of the week the last of the 14 had gained their liberty. The affair excited the greatest sympathy all over England, sympathy which Mr. Gladstone tried to divert by charging 2 of the prisoners with kicking and biting the wardresses. In spite of their vigorous denials, these 2 women were sentenced, on these charges, 1 to 10 days and the other to a month in prison. Although still very weak from the previous hunger strike, they at once entered upon a second hunger strike, and in 3 days had to be released. After this, each succeeding batch of suffragette prisoners, unless otherwise directed, followed the example of these heroic rebels. The prison officials, seeing their authority vanish, were panic-stricken. Holloway and other women's prisons throughout the kingdom became perfect dens of violence and brutality. Hear the account given by Lucy Burns of her experience. We remained quite still when ordered to undress, and when they told us to proceed to our cells we linked arms and stood with our backs to the wall. The governor blew his whistle and a great crowd of wardresses appeared, falling upon us, forcing us apart and dragging us towards the cells. I think I had 12 wardresses for my share, and among them they managed to trip me so that I fell helplessly to the floor. One of the wardresses grasped me by my hair, wound the long braid around her wrist and literally dragged me along the ground. In the cell they fairly ripped the clothing from my back, forcing on me one coarse cotton garment and throwing others on the bed for me to put on myself. Left alone exhausted by the dreadful experience, I lay for a time gasping and shivering on the floor. By and by a wardress came to the door and threw me a blanket. This I wrapped around me, for I was chilled to the bone by this time. The single cotton garment and the rough blanket were all the clothes I wore during my stay in prison. Most of the prisoners refused everything but the blanket. According to agreement, we all broke our windows and were immediately dragged off to the punishment cells. There we hunger-struck, and after enduring great misery for nearly a week, we were one by one released. How simply they tell it. After enduring great misery, but no one who has not gone through the awful experience of the hunger strike can have any idea of how great that misery is. In an ordinary cell it is great enough. In the unspeakable squalor of the punishment cells it is worse. The actual hunger pangs last only about 24 hours with most prisoners. I generally suffer most on the second day. After that there is no very desperate craving for food. Weakness and mental depression take its place. Great disturbances of digestion divert the desire for food to a longing for relief from pain. Often there is intense headache, with fits of dizziness, or slight delirium. Complete exhaustion and a feeling of isolation from earth mark the final stages of the ordeal. Recovery is often protracted, and entire recovery of normal health is sometimes discouragingly slow. The first hunger strike occurred in early July. In the 2 months that followed, scores of women adopted the same form of protest against a government who would not recognize the political character of their offenses. In some cases the hunger strikers were treated with unexampled cruelty. Delicate women were sentenced, not only to solitary confinement, but to wear handcuffs for 24 hours at a stretch. One woman, on refusing prison clothes, was put into a strait waistcoat. The irony of all this appears the greater when it is considered that, at this precise time, the leaders of the Liberal Party in the House of Commons were in the midst of their first campaign against the veto power of the Lords. On September 17 a great meeting was held in Birmingham, on which occasion Mr. Asquith was to throw down his challenge to the Lords, and to announce that their veto was to be abolished, leaving the people's will paramount in England. Of course the suffragettes seized this opportunity for a demonstration. This course was perfectly logical. Denied the right of petition, shut out now from every cabinet minister's meeting, the women were forced to take whatever means that remained to urge their cause upon the government. Mrs. Mary Lee and a group of Birmingham members addressed a warning to the public not to attend Mr. Asquith's meeting as disturbances were likely to happen. From the time that the Prime Minister and his cabinet left the House of Commons until the train drew into the station at Birmingham, they were completely surrounded with detectives and policemen. The precautions taken to guard Mr. Asquith have never been equaled except in the case of the Tsar during outbreaks of revolution in Russia. From the station he was taken by an underground passage a quarter of a mile in length to his hotel, where he dined in solitary state, after having been carried upstairs in a luggage lift. Escorted to the Bingley Hall by a strong guard of mounted police, he was so fearful of encountering the suffragettes that he entered by a side door. The hall was guarded as for a siege. Over the glass roof a thick tarpaulin had been stretched. Tall ladders were placed on either side of the building, and firemen's hose were laid in readiness not to extinguish fires, but to play upon the suffragettes should they appear at an inaccessible spot on the roof. The streets on every hand were barricaded, and police, in regiments, were drawn up to defend the barricades against the onslaughts of the women. Nobody was allowed to pass the barricades without showing his entrance tickets to long files of police, and then the ticket holders were squeezed through the narrow doors one by one. Their precautions were in vain, for the determined suffragettes found more than one way in which to turn Mr. Asquith's triumph into a fiasco. Although no women gained access to the hall, there were plenty of men sympathizers present, and before the meeting had proceeded far 13 men had been violently thrown out for reminding the Prime Minister that the people whose right to govern he was professing to uphold included women as well as men. Outside, mingling in the vast crowds, bands of women attacked the barricades, the outer barricades being thrown down in spite of the thousands of police. From the roof of a neighboring house, Mrs. Lee and Charlotte Marsh tore up dozens of slates and threw them on the roof of Bingley Hall and in the streets below, taking care, however, to strike no one. As Mr. Asquith drove away, the women hurled slates at the guarded motor car. The fire hose was brought forth and the firemen were ordered to turn the water on the women. They refused, to their credit be it said, but the police, infuriated by their failure to keep the peace, did not scruple to play the cold water on the women as they crouched and clung to the dangerous slope of the roof. Roughs in the streets flung bricks at them, drawing blood. Eventually the women were dragged down by the police and in their dripping garments marched through the streets to the police station. The suffragettes who had rushed the barricades and flung stones at Mr. Asquith's departing train received sentences from a fortnight to 1 month, but Miss Marsh and Mrs. Lee were sent to prison for 3 and 4 months respectively. All of the prisoners adopted the hunger strike, as we knew they would. Several days later we were horrified to read in the newspapers that these prisoners were being forcibly fed by means of a rubber tube thrust into the stomach. Members of the union applied at once both at the prison and at the Home Office to learn the truth of the report, but all information was refused. On the following Monday, at our request, Mr. Keir Hardie, at question time in the House, insisted on information from the government. Mr. Masterman, speaking for the Home Secretary, reluctantly admitted that, in order to preserve the dignity of the government and at the same time save the lives of the prisoners, hospital treatment was being administered. Hospital treatment was the term used to draw attention from one of the most disgusting and brutal expedients ever resorted to by prison authorities. No law allows it except in the case of persons certified to be insane, and even then when the operation is performed by skilled nursing attendants under the direction of skilled medical men, it cannot be called safe. In fact, the asylum cases usually die after a short time. The Lancet, perhaps the best-known medical journal in the language, published a long list of opinions from distinguished physicians and surgeons who condemned the practice as applied to the suffrage prisoners as unworthy of civilization. One physician told of a case which had come under his observation in which death had occurred almost as soon as the tube had been inserted. Another cited a case where the tongue, twisted behind the feeding tube, had, in the struggle, been almost bitten off. Cases where food had been injected into the lungs were not unknown. Mr. C. Mansell Mullin, M.D., FRCS, wrote to the Times that as a hospital surgeon of more than 30 years' experience he desired indignantly to protest against the government's term hospital treatment in connection with the forcible feeding of women. It was a foul libel, he declared, for violence and brutality have no place in hospitals. A memorial signed by 116 well-known physicians was addressed to the Prime Minister protesting against the practice of forcible feeding, and pointing out to him in detail the grave dangers attaching to it. So much for medical testimony against a form of brutality which continued and still continues in our English prisons, as a punishment for women who are there for conscience's sake. As for the testimony of the victims, it makes a volume of most revolting sort. Mrs. Lee, the first victim, is a woman of sturdy constitution, else she could scarcely have survived the experience. Thrown into Birmingham prison after the Asquith demonstration, she had broken the windows of her cell, and as a punishment was sent to a dark and cold punishment cell. Her hands were handcuffed, behind her during the day, and at night in front of her body with the palms out. She refused to touch the food that was brought to her, and 3 days after her arrival she was taken to the doctor's room. What she saw was enough to terrify the bravest. In the center of the room was a stout chair resting on a cotton sheet. Against the wall, as if ready for action, stood 4 wardresses. The junior doctor was also on hand. The senior doctor spoke, saying, "Listen carefully to what I have to say. I have orders from my superior officers that you are not to be released even on medical grounds. If you still refrain from food, I must take other measures to compel you to take it." Mrs. Lee replied that she did still refuse, and she said further that she knew that she could not legally be forcibly fed because an operation could not be performed without the consent of the patient if sane. The doctor repeated that he had his orders and would carry them out. A number of wardresses then fell upon Mrs. Lee, held her down and tilted her chair backward. She was so taken by surprise that she could not resist successfully that time. They managed to make her swallow a little food from a feeding cup. Later 2 doctors and the wardresses appeared in her cell, forced Mrs. Lee down to the bed and held her there. To her horror, the doctors produced a rubber tube, 2 yards in length, and this he began to stuff up her nostril. The pain was so dreadful that she shrieked again and again. 3 of the wardresses burst into tears and the junior doctor begged the other to desist. Having had his orders from the government, the doctor persisted and the tube was pushed down into the stomach. One of the doctors, standing on a chair and holding the tube high, poured liquid food through a funnel, almost suffocating the poor victim. "The drums of my ears," she said afterwards, "seemed to be bursting. I could feel the pain to the end of the breastbone. When at last the tube was withdrawn, it felt as if the back of my nose and throat were being torn out with it." In an almost fainting condition, Mrs. Lee was taken back to the punishment cell and laid on her plank bed. The ordeal was renewed day after day. The other prisoners suffered similar experiences. My Own Storybook 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 6. The militant movement was at this point when, in October 1909, I made my first visit to the United States. I shall never forget the excitement of my landing, the first meeting with the American reporter, an experience dreaded by all Europeans. In fact, the first few days seemed a bewildering whirl of reporters and receptions, all leading up to my first lecture at Carnegie Hall on October 25th. The huge hall was entirely filled, and an enormous crowd of people thronged the streets outside for blocks. With me on the stage were several women whom I had met in Europe, and in the chair was an old friend, Mrs. Stanton Blatch, whose early married life had been spent in England. The great crowd before me, however, was made up of strangers, and I could not know how they would respond to my story. When I rose to speak, a deep hush fell, but at my first words, "I am what you call a hooligan," a great shout of warm and sympathetic laughter shook the walls. Then I knew that I had found friends in America. And this all the rest of the tour demonstrated. In Boston, the committee met me with a big gray automobile decorated in the colors of our union, and that night at Tremorne Temple I spoke to an audience of 2,500 people, all most generous in their responsiveness. In Baltimore, professors and students from Johns Hopkins University acted as stewards of the meeting. I greatly enjoyed my visit to Bryn Mawr College and to Rosemary Hall, a wonderful school for girls in Connecticut. In Chicago, I met, among other notable people, Miss Jane Addams and Mrs. Ella Flagg Young, superintendent of schools. My visit to Canada will always be remembered, especially Toronto, where the mayor, dressed in the chains of his office, welcomed me. I met too the venerable Goldwin Smith, since dead. Everywhere I found the Americans kind and keen, and I cannot say too much for the wonderful hospitality they showed me. The women I found were remarkably interested in social welfare. The work of the women's clubs struck me very favorably, and I thought these institutions a perfect basis for a suffrage movement. But at that time, 1909, the suffrage movement in the United States was in a curious state of quiescence. A large number of women with whom I came in contact appeared to think it only just that they should have a vote, but few seemed to realize any actual need of it. Some, it is true, were beginning to connect the vote with the reforms for which they were working so unselfishly and so devotedly. It was when talking with the younger women that I came to feel that under the surface of things in America, a strong suffrage movement was stirring. Those young women, leaving their splendid colleges to begin life, were realizing in a very intelligent fashion that they needed and would be obliged to secure for themselves a political status. On December 1st I sailed on the Mauretania for England, and on arriving I learned that the prison sentence which hung over me while the petitions case had been argued, was discharged, some unknown friend having paid my fine while I was on the ocean. The year 1910 began with a general election, precipitated by the House of Lords' rejection of Mr. Lloyd George's 1909 budget. The Liberal Party went to the country with promises of taxes on land values. They promised also abolition of the veto power of the Lords, Irish Home Rule, disestablishment of the Church of Wales, and other reforms. Woman suffrage was not directly promised, but Mr. Asquith pledged that, if retained in office, he would introduce an electoral reform bill which could be amended to include woman suffrage. The Unionists under the leadership of Mr. Balfour had tariff reform for their programme, and they offered not even a vague promise of a possible suffrage measure. Yet we, as usual, went into the constituencies and opposed the Liberal Party. We had no faith in Mr. Asquith's pledge, and besides, if we had failed to oppose the party in power we should but have invited Mr. Asquith and Mr. Balfour to enter into an agreement not to deal with the suffrage, with the view of keeping the cause permanently outside practical politics. We were in something of the same position as the Irish nationalists in 1885, when neither the Liberal nor the Conservative leaders would include Home Rule in their programme. The Irish opposed the Liberal Party, with the result that it was returned by such a narrow majority that the Liberal government was dependent on the Irish vote in Parliament in order to remain in office. On this account they were obliged to bring in a Home Rule bill. The other suffrage societies and many of the Liberal women begged us not to oppose the Liberal Party at this election. We were implored to waive our claim just this once in view of the importance of the struggle between the Commons and the House of Lords over the budget. We replied that the same plea had been made in 1906 when we were implored to waive our claim just this once on account of the fiscal issue. For women there was only one political issue, we said, and that was the issue of their own enfranchisement. The dispute between the Lords and the Commons was far less vital than the claims of the people represented in this case by women to be admitted to citizenship. From our point of view, both Houses of Parliament were unrepresentative until women had a voice in choosing legislators and influencing law-making. We opposed Liberal candidates in 40 constituencies, and in almost every one of these the Liberal majorities were reduced and no less than 18 seats were wrested from the Liberal candidates. It really was a terrible election for the government. Mr. Asquith travelled from one constituency to another accompanied by a bodyguard of detectives and official chuckers out, whose sole duty was to eject women, and men as well, who interrupted his meetings on the question of votes for women. The halls where he spoke had the windows boarded up or the glass covered with strong wire netting. Every thoroughfare leading to the halls was barricaded, traffic was suspended, and large forces of police were on guard. The most extraordinary precautions were taken to protect the Prime Minister. At one place he went to his meeting strongly guarded and by way of a secret pathway that led through gooseberry bushes and a cabbage patch to a back door. After the meeting he escaped through the same door and was solemnly guided along a path heavily laid with sawdust to deaden his footsteps, to a concealed motor car, where he sat until the crowd had all dispersed. The other ministers had to resort to similar precautions. They lived under the constant protection of bodyguards. Their meetings were policed in a manner without precedent. Of course no women were admitted to their meetings, but they got in just the same. 2 women hid for 25 hours in the rafters of a hall in Louth where Mr. Lloyd George spoke. They were arrested, but not until after they had made their demonstration. 2 others hid under a platform for 22 hours in order to question the Prime Minister. I could continue this record almost indefinitely. We had printed a wonderful poster showing the process of forcible feeding, and we used it on hoardings everywhere. We told the electors that the Liberal Party, the People's Friend, had imprisoned 450 women for the crime of asking for a vote. They were torturing women at that time in Holloway. It was splendid ammunition, and it told. The Liberal Party was returned to power, but with their majority over all sections of the House of Commons swept away. The Asquith government were dependent now for their very existence on the votes of the Labour Party and the Irish nationalists. My Own Storybook 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 7. The first months of 1910 were occupied by the re-elected government in a struggle to keep control of affairs. A coalition with the Irish Party, the leaders of which agreed, if the Home Rule Bill were advanced, to stand by the budget. No publicly announced coalition with the Labour Party was made at that time, Keir Hardie, at the annual conference of the party, announcing that they would continue to be independent of the government. This was important to us because it meant that the Labour Party, instead of entering into an agreement to give general support to all government measures, would be free to oppose the government in the event of the continued withholding of a franchise bill. Other things combined to make us hopeful that the tide had turned in our favour. It was hinted to us that the government were weary of our opposition and were ready to end the struggle in the only possible way, providing they could do so without appearing to yield to coercion. We therefore, early in February, declared a truce to all militancy. Parliament met on February 15 and the King's speech was read on February 21. No mention of women's suffrage was made in the speech, nor was any private member successful in winning a place in the ballot for a suffrage bill. However, since the situation, on account of the proposed abolition of the Lord's power of veto, was strained and abnormal, we decided to wait patiently for a while. It was confidently expected that another general election would have to be held before the contentions between the two Houses of Parliament were settled, and this event unquestionably would have occurred, not later than June, but for the unexpected death of King Edward VII. This interrupted the strained situation. The passing of the king served as an occasion for the temporary softening of animosities and produced a general disposition to compromise on all troubled issues. The question of women's enfranchisement was taken up again in this spirit, and in a manner altogether creditable to the members with whom the movement originated. A strictly non-party committee on women's suffrage had been established in the House of Commons in 1887, mainly through the efforts of Miss Lydia Becker, whom I have mentioned before as the Susan B. Anthony of the English suffrage movement. In 1906, for reasons not necessary to enumerate, the original committee had been allowed to lapse, the Liberal supporters of women's suffrage forming a committee of their own. Now, in this period of good feeling, at the suggestion of certain members, led by Mr. H. N. Brailsford, not himself a member of Parliament, formed another non-party body which they called the Conciliation Committee. Its object was declared to be the bringing together of the full strength of suffragists of the House of Commons, regardless of party affiliation, and of framing a suffrage measure that could be passed by their united effort. The Earl of Lytton accepted the chairmanship of the committee and Mr. Brailsford was made its secretary. The committee consisted of 25 Liberals, 17 Conservatives, 6 Irish nationalists, and 6 members of the Labour Party. Under difficulties which I can hardly hope to make clear to American readers, the committee laboured to frame a bill which should win the support of all sections of the House. The Conservatives insisted on a moderate bill, whilst the Liberals were concerned lest the terms of the bill should add to the power of the propertied classes. The original suffrage bill, drafted by my husband, Dr. Pankhurst, giving the vote to women on equal terms with men, was abandoned, and a bill was drawn up along the lines of the existing municipal franchise law. The basis of the municipal franchise is occupation, and the Conciliation Bill, as first drafted, proposed to extend the parliamentary vote to women householders, and to women occupiers of business premises paying £10 rental and upwards. It was estimated that about 95% of the women who would be enfranchised under the bill were householders. This, in England, does not mean a person occupying a whole house. Anyone who inhabits even a single room over which he or she exercises full control is a householder. The text of the Conciliation Bill was submitted to all the suffrage societies and other women's organizations, and it was accepted by every one of them. Our official newspaper said editorially, "We of the Women's Social and Political Union are prepared to share in this united and peaceful action. The new bill does not give us all that we want, but we are for it if others are also for it." It seemed certain that an overwhelming majority of the House of Commons were for the bill, and were prepared to vote it into law. Although we knew that it could not possibly pass unless the government agreed that it should, we hoped that the leaders of all parties and the majority of their followers would unite in an agreement that the bill should pass. This settlement by consent is rare in the English Parliament, but some extremely important and hard-fought measures have been carried thus. The extension of the franchise in 1867 is a case in point. The Conciliation Bill was introduced into the House of Commons on June 14, 1910, by Mr. D. J. Shackleton, and was received with the most extraordinary enthusiasm. The newspapers remarked on the feeling of reality which marked the attitude of the House towards the bill. It was plain that the members realized that here was no academic question upon which they were merely to debate and to register their opinions, but a measure which was intended to be carried through all its stages and to be written into English law. The enthusiasm of the House swept all over the kingdom. The medical profession sent in a memorial in its favor, signed by more than 300 of the most distinguished men and women in the profession. Memorials from writers, clergymen, social workers, artists, actors, musicians, were also sent. The Women's Liberal Federation met and unanimously resolved to ask the Prime Minister to give full facilities to the bill. Some advanced spirits in the Federation actually proposed to send then and there a deputation to the House of Commons with the resolution, but this proposal was rejected as savouring too much of militancy. A request for an interview was sent to Mr. Asquith, and he replied promising to receive, at an early day, representatives of both the Liberal Women's Federation and of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. The joint deputation was received by Mr. Asquith on June 21, and Lady Emmeline, as a representative of the Women's Liberal Federation, spoke very directly to her party's leader. She said in part, "If you refuse our request, we shall have to go to the country and say you, who are against the veto of the House of Lords, are placing a veto on the House of Commons by refusing to allow a second reading of this bill." Mr. Asquith replied warily that he could not decide alone on such a serious matter, but would have to consult his cabinet, the majority of whom, he admitted, were suffragists. Their decision, he said, would be given in the House of Commons. The Women's Social and Political Union arranged a demonstration in support of the Conciliation Bill, the greatest that had, up to that time, been made. It was a national, indeed an international affair in which all the suffrage groups took part, and its massed ranks were so great that the procession required an hour and a half to pass a given point. At the head marched 617 women, white-clad and holding long silver staves tipped with the broad arrow. These were the women who had suffered imprisonment for the cause, and all along the line of march they received a tribute of cheers from the public. The immense Albert Hall, the largest hall in England, although it was packed from orchestra to the highest gallery, was not large enough to hold all the marchers. Amid great joy and enthusiasm, Lord Lytton delivered a stirring address in which he confidently predicted the speedy advance of the bill. The women, he declared, had every reason to believe that their enfranchisement was actually at hand. It was true that the time for passing a suffrage bill was ripe. Not in 50 years had the way been so clear, because the momentary absence of ordinary legislation left the field open for an electoral reform bill. Yet when the Prime Minister was asked in the House of Commons whether he would give the members an early opportunity for discussion, the answer was not encouraging. "The government," said Mr. Asquith, were prepared to give time before the close of the session for full debate and division on second reading, but they could not allow any further facilities. He stated frankly that he personally did not want the bill to pass, but the government realized that the House of Commons ought to have an opportunity, if that was their deliberate desire, for effectively dealing with the whole question. This cryptic utterance was taken by the majority of the suffragists, by the press and by the public generally to mean that the government were preparing gracefully to yield to the undoubted desire of the House of Commons to pass the bill. But the women's social and political union were doubtful. Mr. Asquith's remark was ambiguous, and was capable of being interpreted in several ways. It could mean that he was prepared to accept the verdict of the majority and let the bill pass through all its stages. That, of course, would be the only way to allow the House opportunity effectively to deal with the whole question. On the other hand, Mr. Asquith might be intending to let the bill pass through its debating stages and be afterwards smothered in committee. We feared treachery, but in view of the announcement that the government had set apart July the 11th and 12th for debate on the second reading, we preserved a spirit of waiting calm. July 26th had been fixed as the day for the adjournment of Parliament, and if the bill was voted on favourably on the 12th, there would be ample time to take it through its final stages. When a bill passes its second reading, it is normally sent upstairs to a grand committee which sits while the House of Commons is transacting other business, and thus the committee stage can proceed without special facilities. The bill does not go back to the House until the report stage is reached, at which time the third and last reading occurs. After that, the bill goes to the House of Lords. A week at most is all that is required for this procedure. A bill may be referred to the whole House, and in this case it cannot be brought up for its committee stage unless it is given special facilities. In our paper and in many public speeches we urged that the members vote to send the bill to a grand committee. Some days before the bill reached its second reading, it was rumoured that Mr. Lloyd George was going to speak against it, but we refused to credit this. Unfair to women as Mr. Lloyd George had shown himself in various ways, he had consistently posed as a staunch friend of women's suffrage, and we could not believe that he would turn against us at the 11th hour. Mr. Winston Churchill, whose speech to the women of Dundee I quoted in a previous chapter, the promoters of the bill also counted upon, as it was known that he had more than once expressed sympathy with its objects. But when the debates began, we found both of these ardent suffragists arrayed against the bill. Mr. Churchill, after making a conventional anti-suffrage speech, in which he said that women did not need the ballot, and that they really had no grievances, attacked the Conciliation Bill because the class of women who would be enfranchised under it did not suit him. Some women, he conceded, ought to be enfranchised, and he thought the best plan would be to select some of the best women of all classes on considerations of property, education, and earning capacity. These special franchises would be carefully balanced, so as not on the whole to give undue advantage to the property vote against the wage-earning vote. A more fantastic proposal, and one less likely to find favour in the House of Commons, could not possibly be imagined. Mr. Churchill's second objection to the bill was that it was anti-democratic. It seemed to us that anything was more democratic than his proposed fancy franchises. Mr. Lloyd George said that he agreed with everything Mr. Churchill had said, both relevant and irrelevant. He made the amazing assertion that the Conciliation Committee that had drafted the bill was a committee of women meeting outside the House. And that this committee said to the House of Commons not only that they must vote for a women's suffrage bill, but you must vote for the particular form upon which we agree, and we will not even allow you to deliberate upon any other form. Of course these statements were wholly false. The Conciliation Bill was drafted by men, and it was introduced because the government had refused to bring in a party measure. The suffragists would have been only too glad to have had the government deliberate on a broader form of suffrage. Because they refused to deliberate on any form, this private bill was introduced. This fact was brought forward in the course of Mr. Lloyd George's speech. It had been urged, said he, that this bill was better than none at all, but why should that be the alternative? "What is the other?" called out a member, but Mr. Lloyd George dodged the question with a careless "Well, I cannot say for the present." Later on he said, "If the promoters of this bill say that they regard the second reading merely as an affirmation of the principle of women's suffrage, and if they promise that when they reintroduce the bill it will be in a form which will enable the House of Commons to move any amendment either for restriction or extension, I shall be happy to vote for this bill." Mr. Philip Snowden, replying to this, said, "We will withdraw this bill if the right honourable gentleman, on behalf of the government, or the Prime Minister himself will undertake to give to this House the opportunity of discussing and carrying through its various stages another form of franchise bill. If we cannot get that, then we shall prosecute this bill." The government made no reply at all to this, and the debate proceeded. 39 speeches were made, the Prime Minister showing plainly in his speech that he intended to use all his power to prevent the bill becoming law. He began by saying that a franchise measure ought never to be sent to a grand committee, but to one of the whole House. He said also that his conditions, that the majority of women should show beyond any doubt that they desired the franchise, and that the bill be democratic in its terms, had not been complied with. When the division was taken, it was seen that the Conciliation Bill had passed its second reading by a majority of 109, a larger majority than the government's far-famed budget or the House of Lords resolution had received. In fact, no measure during that Parliament had received so great a majority. 299 members voted for it as against 190 opposed. Then the question arose as to which committee should deal with the bill. Mr. Asquith had said that all franchise bills should go to a committee of the whole House, so that in the division his words moved many sincere friends of the bill to send it there. Others understood that this was a mischievous course, but were afraid of incurring the anger of the Prime Minister. Of course all the anti-suffragists voted the same way, and thus the bill went to the whole House. Even then the bill could have been advanced to its final reading. The House had time on their hands, as virtually all important legislative work was halted because of the deadlock between the Lords and the Commons. Following the death of the King, a conference of leaders of the Conservative and the Liberal parties had been arranged to adjust the matters at issue, and this conference had not yet reported. Hence Parliament had little business on hand. The strongest possible pressure was brought to bear upon the government to give facilities to the Conciliation Bill. A number of meetings were held in support of the bill. The Men's Political Union for Women's Enfranchisement, the Men's League for Women's Suffrage and the Conciliation Committee held a joint meeting in Hyde Park. Some of the old school of suffragists held another large meeting in Trafalgar Square. The Women's Social and Political Union, on July 23, which was the anniversary of the day in 1867 on which working men, agitating for their vote, had pulled down the Hyde Park railings, held another enormous demonstration there. A space of half a square mile was cleared, 40 platforms erected, and 2 great processions marched from east and west to the meeting. Many other suffrage societies cooperated with us on this occasion. On the very day of that meeting Mr. Asquith wrote to Lord Lytton refusing to allow any more time for the bill during that session. Those who still had faith that the government could be induced to do justice to women set their hopes on the autumn session of Parliament. Resolutions urging the government to give the bill facilities during the autumn were sent, not only by the suffrage associations but from many organisations of men. The corporations of 38 cities, including Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Dublin and Cork, sent resolutions to this effect. Cabinet ministers were besieged with requests to receive deputations of women, and since the country was on the verge of a general election, and the Liberal Party wanted the services of women, their requests could not altogether be ignored. Mr. Asquith, early in October, received a deputation of women from his own constituency of East Fife, but all he had to tell them was that the bill could not be advanced that year. "What about next year?" they asked, and he replied shortly, "Wait and see." It had been exceedingly difficult, during these troublous days, to hold all the members of the WSPU to the truce, and when it became perfectly apparent that the Conciliation Bill was doomed, war was again declared. At a great meeting held in Albert Hall on November 10, I myself threw down the gauge of battle. I said, because I wanted the whole matter to be clearly understood by the public as well as by our members, this is the last constitutional effort of the Women's Social and Political Union to secure the passage of the bill into law. If the bill, in spite of our efforts, is killed by the government, then first of all, I have to say there is an end of the truce. If we are met by the statement that there is no power to secure on the floor of the House of Commons time for our measure, then our first step is to say, we take it out of your hands, since you fail to help us, and we resume the direction of the campaign ourselves. Another deputation, I declared, must go to the House of Commons to carry a petition to the Prime Minister. I myself would lead, and if no one cared to follow me I would go alone. Instantly, all over the hall, women sprang to their feet crying out, "Mrs. Pankhurst, I will go with you. I will go. I will go." And I knew that our brave women were as ever ready to give themselves, their very lives, if need be, for the cause of freedom. The autumn session convened on Friday, November 18, and Mr. Asquith announced that Parliament would be adjourned on November 28. While his speech was in progress, 450 women, in small groups, to keep within the strict letter of the law, were marching from Caxton Hall and from the headquarters of the Union. How to tell the story of that dreadful day, Black Friday, as it lives in our memory, how to describe what happened to English women at the behest of an English government, is a difficult task. I will try to tell it as simply and as accurately as possible. The plain facts, baldly stated, I am aware will strain credulity. Remember that the country was on the eve of a general election, and that the Liberal Party needed the help of Liberal women. This fact made the wholesale arrest and imprisonment of great numbers of women, who were demanding the passage of the Conciliation Bill, extremely undesirable from the government's point of view. The women's Liberal federations also wanted the passage of the Conciliation Bill, although they were not ready to fight for it. What the government feared was that the Liberal women would be stirred by our sufferings into refraining from doing election work for the party. So the government conceived a plan whereby the suffragettes were to be punished, were to be turned back and defeated in their purpose of reaching the House, but would not be arrested. Orders were evidently given that the police were to be present in the streets, and that the women were to be thrown from one uniformed or ununiformed policeman to another, that they were to be so rudely treated that sheer terror would cause them to turn back. I say orders were given, and as one proof of this I can first point out that on all previous occasions the police had first tried to turn back the deputations and when the women persisted in going forward, had arrested them. At times individual policemen had behaved with cruelty and malice toward us, but never anything like the unanimous and wholesale brutality that was shown on Black Friday. The government very likely hoped that the violence of the police towards the women would be emulated by the crowds, but instead the crowds proved remarkably friendly. They pushed and struggled to make a clear pathway for us, and in spite of the efforts of the police my small deputation actually succeeded in reaching the door of the strangers' entrance. We mounted the steps to the enthusiastic cheers of the multitudes that filled the streets, and we stood there for hours gazing down on a scene which I hope never to look upon again. At intervals of 2 or 3 minutes small groups of women appeared in the square, trying to join us at the strangers' entrance. They carried little banners inscribed with various mottos: Asquith has vetoed our bill, where there's a bill there's a way, women's will beats Asquith's won't, and the like. These banners the police seized and tore in pieces. Then they laid hands on the women and literally threw them from one man to another. Some of the police used their fists, striking the women in their faces, their breasts, their shoulders. One woman I saw thrown down with violence 3 or 4 times in rapid succession, until at last she lay only half conscious against the curb, and in a serious condition was carried away by kindly strangers. Every moment the struggle grew fiercer, as more and more women arrived on the scene. Women, many of them eminent in art, in medicine and science, women of European reputation, subjected to treatment that would not have been meted out to criminals, and all for the offense of insisting upon the right of peaceful petition. This struggle lasted for about an hour, more and more women successfully pushing their way past the police and gaining the steps of the house. Then the mounted police were summoned to turn the women back. But, desperately determined, the women, fearing not the hoofs of the horses or the crushing violence of the police, did not swerve from their purpose. And now the crowds began to murmur. People began to demand why the women were being knocked about, why, if they were breaking the law, they were not arrested, why, if they were not breaking the law, they were not permitted to go on unmolested. For a long time, nearly 5 hours, the police continued to hustle and beat the women, the crowds becoming more and more turbulent in their defense. Then, at last the police were obliged to make arrests. 115 women and 4 men, most of them bruised and choked and otherwise injured, were arrested. While all this was going on outside the House of Commons, the Prime Minister was obstinately refusing to listen to the counsels of some of the saner and more justice-loving members of the House. Keir Hardie, Sir Alfred Mondell and others urged Mr. Asquith to receive the deputation, and Lord Castlereagh went so far as to move as an amendment to a government proposal, another proposal which would have compelled the government to provide immediate facilities to the Conciliation Bill. We heard of what was going on, and I sent in for one and another friendly member and made every possible effort to influence them in favour of Lord Castlereagh's amendment. I pointed to the brutal struggle that was going on in the square, and I begged them to go back and tell the others that it must be stopped. But, distressed as some of them undoubtedly were, they assured me that there was not the slightest chance for the amendment. "Is there not a single man in the House of Commons," I cried, "one who will stand up for us, who will make the House see that the amendment must go forward?" Well, perhaps there were men there, but all save 52 put their party loyalty before their manhood, and, because Lord Castlereagh's proposal would have meant censure of the government, they refused to support it. This did not happen, however, until Mr. Asquith had resorted to his usual crafty device of a promise of future action. In this instance he promised to make a statement on behalf of the government on the following Tuesday. The next morning the suffrage prisoners were arraigned in police court. Or rather, they were kept waiting outside the courtroom while Mr. Musket, who prosecuted on behalf of the Chief Commissioner of Police, explained to the astounded magistrate that he had received orders from the Home Secretary that the prisoners should all be discharged. Mr. Churchill, it was declared, had had the matter under careful consideration, and had decided that no public advantage would be gained by proceeding with the prosecution, and accordingly no evidence would be given against the prisoners. Subdued laughter and, according to the newspapers, some contemptuous booing were raised in the court, and when order was restored the prisoners were brought in batches and told that they were discharged. On the following Tuesday the WSPU held another meeting of the Women's Parliament in Caxton Hall to hear the news from the House of Commons. Mr. Asquith said, "The government will, if they are still in power, give facilities in the next Parliament for effectively proceeding with a franchise bill which is so framed as to admit of free amendment." He would not promise that this would be done during the first year of Parliament. We had demanded facilities for the Conciliation Bill, and Mr. Asquith's promise was too vague and too ambiguous to please us. The Parliament now about to be dissolved had lasted a scant 10 months. The next one might not last longer. Therefore, Mr. Asquith's promise, as usual, meant nothing at all. I said to the women, "I am going to Downing Street. Come along, all of you." And we went. We found a small force of police in Downing Street, and we easily broke through their line and would have invaded the Prime Minister's residence had not reinforcements of police arrived on the scene. Mr. Asquith himself appeared unexpectedly, and as we thought, very opportunely. Before he could have realized what was happening he found himself surrounded by angry suffragettes. He was well hooted and, it is said, well shaken, before he was rescued by the police. As his taxicab rushed away some object struck one of the windows, smashing it. Another cabinet minister, Mr. Birrell, unwittingly got into the midst of the melee, and I am obliged to record that he was pretty thoroughly hustled. But it is not true that his leg was injured by the women. His haste to jump into a taxicab resulted in a slightly sprained ankle. That night and the following day windows were broken in the houses of Sir Edward Grey, Mr. Winston Churchill, Mr. Lewis Harcourt and Mr. John Burns, and also in the official residences of the Premier and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. That week 160 suffragettes were arrested, but all except those charged with window-breaking or assault were discharged. This amazing court action established two things. First, that when the Home Secretary stated that he had no responsibility for the prosecution and sentencing of suffrage prisoners, he told a colossal falsehood, and second, that the government fully realized that it was bad election tactics to be responsible for the imprisonment of women of good character who were struggling for citizenship. My Own Story Book 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst. Read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Chapter 8. Almost immediately after the events chronicled in the preceding chapter, one sailed for my second tour through the United States. I was delighted to find a thoroughly alive and progressive suffrage movement, where before had existed with most people only an academic theory in favor of equal political rights between men and women. My first meeting, held in Brooklyn, was advertised by Sandwich women walking through the principal streets of the city, quite like our militant suffragists at home. Street meetings, I found, were now daily occurrences in New York. The Women's Political Union had adopted an election policy, and throughout the country as far west as I traveled, I found women awakened to the necessity of political action instead of mere discussion of suffrage. My second visit to America, like my first one, is clouded in my memory with sorrow. Very soon after my return to England, a beloved sister, Mrs. Mary Clark, died. My sister, who was a most ardent suffragist and a valued worker in the Women's Social and Political Union, was one of the women who was shockingly maltreated in Parliament Square on Black Friday. She was also one of the women who, a few days later, registered their protest against the government by throwing a stone through the window of an official residence. For this act she was sent to Holloway Prison for a term of 1 month. Released on December 21st, it was plain to those who knew her best that her health had suffered seriously from the dreadful experience of Black Friday and the after-experience of prison. She died suddenly on Christmas Day, to the profound sorrow of all her associates. Hers was not the only life that was sacrificed as a result of that day. Other deaths occurred, mostly from hearts weakened by overstrain. Miss Henria Williams died on January 2, 1911, from heart failure. Miss Cecilia Wolseley Haig was another victim. Ill treatment on Black Friday resulted in her case in a painful illness which ended, after a year of intense suffering, in her death on December 21, 1911. It is not possible to publish a full list of all the women who have died or have been injured for life in the course of the suffrage agitation in England. In many cases the details have never been made public, and I do not feel at liberty to record them here. A very celebrated case, which is public property, is that of Lady Constance Lytton, sister of the Earl of Lytton, who acted as chairman of the Conciliation Committee. Lady Constance had twice in 1909 gone to prison as a result of suffrage activities, and on both occasions had been given special privileges on account of her rank and family influence. In spite of her protests and her earnest pleadings to be accorded the same treatment as other suffrage prisoners, the snobbish and cowardly authorities insisted in retaining Lady Constance in the hospital cells and discharging her before the expiration of her sentence. This was done on a plea of her ill health, and it was true that she suffered from a valvular disease of the heart. Smarting under the sense of the injustice done her comrades in this discrimination, Lady Constance Lytton did one of the most heroic deeds to be recorded in the history of the suffrage movement. She cut off her beautiful hair and otherwise disguised herself, put on cheap and ugly clothing, and as Jane Wharton took part in a demonstration at Newcastle, again suffering arrest and imprisonment. This time the authorities treated her as an ordinary prisoner. Without testing her heart or otherwise giving her an adequate medical examination, they subjected her to the horrors of forcible feeding. Owing to her fragile constitution, she suffered frightful nausea each time, and when on one occasion the doctor's clothing was soiled, he struck her contemptuously on the cheek. This treatment was continued until the identity of the prisoner suddenly became known. She was, of course, immediately released, but she never recovered from the experience, and is now a hopeless invalid. I want to say right here, that those well-meaning friends on the outside who say that we have suffered these horrors of prison, of hunger strikes and forcible feeding, because we desired to martyrize ourselves for the cause, are absolutely and entirely mistaken. We never went to prison in order to be martyrs. We went there in order that we might obtain the rights of citizenship. We were willing to break laws that we might force men to give us the right to make laws. That is the way men have earned their citizenship. Truly says Mazzini that the way to reform has always led through prison. The result of the general election, which took place in January 1911, was that the Liberal Party was again returned to power. Parliament met on January 31st, but the session formally opened on February 6th with the reading of the King's speech. The programme for the session included the Lords' veto measure, Home Rule, payment for members of Parliament, and the abolishment of plural voting. Invalid insurance was also mentioned and certain amendments to the Old Age Pension Bill. Women's suffrage was not mentioned. Nevertheless, we were singularly lucky, the first 3 places in the ballot being secured by members of the Conciliation Committee. Mr. Phillips, an Irish member, drew the first place, but as the Irish Party had decided not to introduce any bills that session, he yielded to Sir George Kemp, who announced that he would use his place for the purpose of taking a second reading debate on the new Conciliation Bill. The old bill had been entitled, "A Bill to Give the Vote to Women Occupiers," a title that made amendment difficult. The new bill bore the more flexible title, "A Bill to Confer the Parliamentary Franchise on Women," thus doing away with one of Mr. Lloyd George's most plausible objections to it. The £10 occupation clause was omitted, doing away with another objection, that of the possibility of faggot voting, that is, of a rich man conferring the vote on a family of daughters by the simple expedient of making them tenants of slices of his own property. The Conciliation Bill now read, 1. Every woman possessed of a household qualification within the meaning of the Representation of the People Act, 1884, shall be entitled to be registered as a voter, and when registered to vote in the county or borough in which the qualifying premises are situated. 2. For the purposes of this Act, a woman shall not be disqualified by marriage for being registered as a voter, provided that a husband and wife shall not both be registered as voters in the same parliamentary borough or county division. This bill met with even warmer approval than the first one, because it was believed that it would win votes from those members who felt that the original measure had fallen short of being truly democratic. Nevertheless, the Prime Minister showed from the first that he intended to oppose it, as he had all previous suffrage measures. He announced that all Fridays up to Easter and also all time on Tuesdays and Wednesdays usually allowed for private members' bills were to be occupied with consideration of government measures. Hardly a Liberal voice was raised against this arbitrary ruling. The Irish members indeed were delighted with it, since it gave the Home Rule Bill an advantage. The Labour members seemed complacent, and the rest of the coalition were indifferent. One backbench Liberal went so far as to rise and thank the Prime Minister for the courtesy with which the gagging process was accomplished. There was some show of fight made by the opposition, but Conservative indignation was tempered by the reflection that the precedent established might be followed to advantage when their party came into power. Sir George Kemp then announced that he would take May 5 for the second reading of the Conciliation Bill, and the supporters of the bill, according to their various convictions, set to work to further its interests. The conviction of the WSPU was that Mr. Asquith's government would never allow the bill to pass until they were actually forced to do so, and we adopted our own methods to secure a definite pledge from the government that they would give facilities to the bill. In April of that year the census was to be taken, and we organized a census resistance on the part of women. According to our law, the census of the entire kingdom must be taken every 10 years on a designated day. Our plan was to reduce the value of the census for statistical purposes by refusing to make the required returns. Two ways of resistance presented themselves. The first and most important was direct resistance by occupiers who should refuse to fill in the census papers. This laid the register open to a fine of £5 or a month's imprisonment, and thus required the exercise of considerable courage. The second means of resistance was evasion, staying away from home during the entire time that the enumerators were taking the census. We made the announcement of this plan, and instantly there ensued a splendid response from women and a chorus of horrified disapproval from the conservative public. The Times voiced this disapproval in a leading article, to which I replied, giving our reasons for the protest. "The census," I wrote, "is a numbering of the people. Until women count as people for the purpose of representation in the councils of the nation as well as for purposes of taxation, we shall refuse to be numbered." On the subject of laws made by men without the assistance of women for the protection of women and children, I have a very special feeling. From my experience as poor law guardian and as registrar of births and deaths, I know how ridiculously, say rather how tragically, these laws fall short of protection. Take for instance the vaunted Children's Charter of 1906, the measure which spread Mr. Lloyd George's fame throughout the world. A volume could be filled with the mistakes and the cruelties of that act, the object of which is the preservation and improvement of child life. A distinguishing characteristic of the Act is that it puts most of the responsibility for neglect of children on the backs of the mothers, who, under the laws of England, have no rights as parents. 2 or 3 especially striking cases of this kind came into notice about this time, and gave the census resistance an additional justification. The case of Annie Woolmore was a very pitiful one. She was arrested and sentenced to Holloway for 6 weeks for neglecting her children. The evidence showed that the woman lived with her husband and children in a miserable hovel, which would have been almost impossible to keep clean even if there had been water in the house. As it was, the poor soul, who was in ill health and weakened by deprivation, had to carry all the water she used across a great distance. The children as well as the house were very dirty, it was true, but the children were well nourished and kindly treated. The husband, a laborer, out of work much of the time, testified that his wife starved herself to feed the kids. Yet she had violated the terms of the Children's Charter and she went to prison. I am glad to say that owing to the efforts of suffragists she was pardoned and provided with a better home. Another case was that of Helen Conroy, who was charged with living in one wretched room, with her husband and 7 children, the youngest a month old. According to the law, the mother was forbidden to have this infant in bed with her overnight, yet part of the charge against her was that the child was found sleeping in a box of damp straw. Doubtless she would have preferred a cradle, or even a box of dry straw. But direst poverty made the cradle impossible and the conditions of the tenement kept the straw damp. Both parents in this instance were sent to prison for 3 months at hard labor. The magistrate casually remarked that the house in which these poor people lived had been condemned 2 years before, but some respectable property owner was still collecting rents from it. Another poor mother, evicted from her home because she could not pay the rent, took her 4 children out into the open country, and when found was sleeping with them in a gravel pit. She was sent to prison for a month and the children went to the workhouse. These sorry mothers, logical results of the subjection of women, are enough in themselves to justify almost any defiance of a government who deny the women the right to work out their destinies in freedom. No pledge having been secured from the Prime Minister by April 1st, we carried out, and most successfully, our census resistance. Many thousands of women all over the country refused or evaded the returns. I returned my census paper with the words "No vote, no census" written across it, and other women followed that example with similar messages. One woman filled in the blank with full information about her one-man servant, and added that there were many women but no more persons in her household. In Birmingham, 16 women of wealth packed their houses with women resistors. They slept on the floors, on chairs and tables, and even in the baths. The head of a large college threw open the building to 300 women. Many women in other cities held all-night parties for friends who wished to remain away from home. In some places, unoccupied houses were rented for the night by resistors, who lay on the bare boards. Some groups of women hired gypsy vans and spent the night on the moors. In London, we gave a great concert at Queen's Hall on census night. Many of us walked about Trafalgar Square until midnight and then repaired to Aldwych skating rink, where we amused ourselves until morning. Some skated while others looked on, and enjoyed the admirable musical and theatrical entertainment that helped to pass the hours. We had with us a number of the brightest stars in the theatrical world, and they were generous in their contributions. It being Sunday night, the chairman had to call on each of the artists for a speech instead of a song or other turn. An all-night restaurant near at hand did a big business, and on the whole the resistors had a very good time. The Scala Theatre was the scene of another all-night entertainment. There was a good deal of curiosity to see what the government would devise in the way of a punishment for the rebellious women, but the government realized the impossibility of taking punitive action, and Mr. John Burns, who, as head of the local government board, was responsible for the census, announced that they had decided to treat the affair with magnanimity. The number of evasions, he declared, was insignificant. But everyone knew that this was the exact reverse of the facts. The Conciliation Bill was debated on May 5 and passed its second reading by the enormous majority of 137. And now the public and a section of the press united in a strong demand that the government yield to the undoubted will of the House and grant facilities to the bill. The Conciliation Committee sent a deputation of members to the Prime Minister to remind him of his pre-election promise that the House of Commons should have an opportunity of dealing with the whole question of women's suffrage, but they succeeded only in getting his assurance that he had the matter under consideration. Late in the month, the announcement was made in the House that the government would not grant facilities during that session, but, since the new bill fulfilled the conditions named by the Prime Minister, and was now capable of amendment, the government recognized it to be their duty to grant facilities in some session of the present Parliament. They would be prepared next session, when the bill had been again read for the second time, either as a result of obtaining a good place in the ballot, or, if that did not happen, by a grant of a government day for the purpose, to give a week, which they understood to be the time suggested as reasonable by the promoters for its further stages. This pledge was made in order to deter the WSPU from making a militant demonstration in connection with the coronation of the King. Keir Hardie asked if the government would, by means of a closure or otherwise, make certain that the bill would go through in the week, and the Prime Minister replied, "No, I cannot give an assurance of that kind. After all, it is a problem of the very greatest magnitude." This reply seemed to make the government's pledge practically worthless. The Conciliation Committee also realized the possibilities of the bill being talked out, and Lord Lytton wrote to Mr. Asquith and asked him for assurances that the facilities offered were intended not for academic discussion but for effective opportunity for carrying the bill. He also asked that the week offered should not be construed rigidly but that, providing the committee stage were got through in the time, additional days for the report and third reading stages might be forthcoming. Reasonable opportunity for making use of the closure was also asked. To Lord Lytton's letter the Prime Minister replied as follows. My dear Lytton, in reply to your letter on the subject of the Women's Enfranchisement Bill, I would refer you to some observations recently made in a speech at the National Liberal Club by Sir Edward Grey, which accurately expresses the intention of the government. It follows, to answer your specific inquiries, that the week offered will be interpreted with reasonable elasticity, that the government will interpose no reasonable obstacle to the proper use of the closure, and that if, as you suggest, the bill gets through committee in the time proposed, the extra days required for report and third reading will not be refused. The government, though divided in opinion on the merits of the bill, are unanimous in their determination to give effect, not only in the letter but in the spirit, to the promise in regard to facilities which I made on their behalf before the last general election. Yours etc., HHSQUITH. Skeptical up to this point, the WSPU was now convinced that the government were sincere in their promise to give the bill full facilities in the following year. We held a joyful mass meeting in Queen's Hall, and I again declared that warfare against the government was at an end. Our new policy was the inauguration of a great holiday campaign, with the object of making victory in 1912 absolutely certain. Electors must be aroused, members of Parliament held to their allegiance. Women must be organized in order that questions that vitally affect the social welfare of the country might be placed before them. I chose Scotland and Wales as the scenes of my holiday labours. I may say that our confidence was fully shared by the public at large. The belief in Mr. Asquith's pledge was accurately reflected in a leader published in The Nation, which said, "From the moment the Prime Minister signed the frank and ungrudging letter to Lord Lytton which appeared in last Saturday's newspapers, women became, in all but the legal formality, voters and citizens. For at least 2 years, if not for longer, nothing has been lacking save a full and fair opportunity for the House of Commons to translate its convictions into the precise language of a statute. That opportunity has been promised for next session and promised in terms and under conditions which ensure success. The only thing, as we thought, that we had to fear were wrecking amendments to the bill, and in the new by-election policy which we adopted we worked against all candidates of every party who would refuse to promise, not only to support the Conciliation Committee to carry the bill, but also to vote against any amendment the committee thought dangerous. We believed that we had covered every possibility of disaster. But we had something yet to learn of the treachery of the Asquith ministry and their capacity for cold-blooded lying. Mr. Lloyd George from the first was an open enemy of the bill, but since we had no doubt of the sincerity of the Prime Minister, we could only conclude that Mr. Lloyd George had detached himself from the main body of the government and had become the self-constituted leader of the opposition. In an address to a large Liberal group, Mr. Lloyd George advised that Liberal members be asked to ballot for a place for a democratic measure, in order that such a measure might claim the Prime Minister's pledge for facilities next session. In one or two other speeches, he made vague allusions to the possibilities of introducing another suffrage bill. His own idea was to amend the bill to give a vote to wives of all electors, making married women voters in virtue of their husband's qualification. The inevitable effect of such an amendment would be to wreck the bill, since it would have enfranchised about 6 million women in addition to the 1.5 million who would benefit by the original terms of the bill. Such a wholesale addition to the electorate was never known in England, the number enfranchised by the Reform Bill of 1832 being hardly more than 500,000. The Reform Bill of 1867 admitted 1 million new voters, and that of 1884 perhaps 2 millions. The absurdity of Mr. Lloyd George's proposition was such that we did not regard it seriously. We did not allow his opposition to give us serious alarm until a day in August when a Welsh member, Mr. Leif Jones, asked the Prime Minister from the floor of the House whether he was aware that his promise for facilities for the Conciliation Bill in the next session was being claimed exclusively for that bill, and asked further for a statement that the promised facilities would be equally granted to any other suffrage bill that might secure a second reading and was capable of amendment. Mr. Lloyd George, speaking for the government, replied that they could not undertake to give facilities to more than one bill on the same subject, but that any bill which, satisfying these tests, secured a second reading, would be treated by them as falling within their engagements. Astounded at this plain evasion of a sacred promise, Lord Lytton again wrote to the Prime Minister, reviewing the entire matter, and asking for another statement of the government's intentions. The following is the text of Mr. Asquith's reply. My dear Lytton, I have no hesitation in saying that the promises made by, and on behalf of the government, in regard to giving facilities to the Conciliation Bill, will be strictly adhered to, both in letter and in spirit. Yours sincerely, HHSQH. August 23, 1911. Again we were reassured, and our confidence in the Premier's pledge remained unshaken throughout the campaign, although Mr. Lloyd George continued to throw out hints that the promises of facilities for the bill were altogether illusory. We could not believe him, and when, 2 months later, I was asked in America, "When will English women vote?" I replied with perfect conviction, "Next year." This was in Louisville, Kentucky, where I attended the 1911 annual convention of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. I remember this third visit to the United States with especial pleasure. I was the guest in New York of Dr. and Mrs. John Winters Brannan, and through the courtesy of Dr. Brannan, who is at the head of all the city hospitals, I saw something of the penal system and the institutional life of America. We visited the workhouse and the penitentiary on Blackwell's Island, and although I am told that these places are not regarded as model institutions, I can assure my readers that they are infinitely superior to the English prisons where women are punished for trying to win their political freedom. In the American prisons, much as they lacked in some essentials, I saw no solitary confinement, no rule of silence, no deadly air of officialdom. The food was good and varied, and above all there was an air of kindness and good feeling between the officials and the prisoners that is almost wholly lacking in England. But, after all, in the United States as in other countries, the problem of the relations between unfranchised women and the state remains unsolved and unsatisfactory. One night my friends took me to that somber and terrible institution, the Night Court for Women. We sat on the bench with the magistrate, and he very courteously explained everything to us. The whole business was heartbreaking. All the women, with one exception an old drunkard, were charged with solicitation. Most of them were of high type by nature. It all seemed so hopeless, and it was clear that they were victims of an evil system. Their conviction was a foregone conclusion. The magistrate said that in most cases the reason for their coming there was economic. One case of a little cigar maker, who said very simply that she only went on the streets when out of work, and that when in work she earned $8 a week, was very tragic and touching. I could not keep the Night Court out of my speeches after that. The whole dreadful injustice of women's lives seemed mirrored in that place. I went as far west as the Pacific coast on this visit, spending Christmas Day in Seattle, and for the first time seeing a community where women and men existed on terms of exact equality. It was a delightful experience. As I wrote home to our members, the men of the Western states seemed to my eyes eager, earnest, rough men, building a great community in a great hurry, but never have I seen greater respect, courtesy, and chivalry shown to women than in that one suffrage state it has been my privilege to visit. I am getting a little ahead of my story, however. It was in November, when I was in the city of Minneapolis, that a crushing blow descended on the English suffragists. I learned of this through cabled dispatches in the newspapers and from private cables, and was so staggered that I could scarcely command myself sufficiently to fill my immediate engagements. This was the news, that the government had broken their plighted word and had deliberately destroyed the Conciliation Bill. My first wild thought, on hearing of this act of treachery, was to cancel all engagements and return to England, but my final decision to remain afterwards proved the right one, because the women at home, without a moment's loss of time, struck the answering blow, guided by that insight which has been characteristic of every act of the members of our union. I did not return to England until January 11, 1912, and by that time great deeds had been done. Our movement had entered upon a new and more vigorous stage of militancy. The end. My Own Storybook 2 by Emmeline Pankhurst was read for you by Long Stories for Sleep. Thank you for listening. If you liked it, there is a button